Good evening, listeners. Welcome to Noir Intellect. I'm your host, Victor Blackwood. If you enjoy mysteries, hidden clues, and uncovering the truth, don't forget to like and subscribe. And tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Leave it in the comments below. Now, keep your eyes open and your mind sharp. The mystery begins now. Chapter 1. The Altered Photograph. The photograph arrived at 11:20 in the morning, carried by a woman who held it as though it had already killed somebody. That was my first impression of Margaret Holloway. And first impressions are useful, even when they are wrong. She was in her middle 30s, tall, neatly dressed, and pale enough to suggest either sleeplessness or determination. Her dark coat was damp from a March rain, but the large brown envelope under her arm had been protected with more care than most people give a baby. She stood on the stoop of the old brownstone on West 35th Street and looked directly at me. "Mr. Nero Wolfe, you have reached his house," I said. "Reaching him is more complicated. I telephoned yesterday." That was true. She had spoken with me for 4 minutes and refused to explain her business beyond saying it concerned an old family photograph and a person who might not exist. I had given her an appointment because the phrase caught my attention, not Wolfe's. I took her coat and led her into the office. Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms, spending the scheduled 2 hours with 10,000 orchids. A murderer could have climbed through the window, carrying a signed confession, and Wolfe would still have expected him to wait until 11. Margaret Holloway sat in the red leather chair and kept the envelope on her lap. "You protect that well," I said. "It has been damaged enough." "By accident?" "No." That answer improved the morning. At 11 exactly, the elevator hummed in the hall. Wolfe entered a moment later, broad, composed, and offended by the existence of weather. He crossed to his custom-made chair behind the desk, lowered himself into it, and looked at our visitor. "Miss Holloway," I said. "She has brought a photograph involving a person who may not exist." Wolfe's eyes moved to me. That description applies to most photographs after sufficient time. Margaret placed the envelope on his desk. "My father died 3 weeks ago," she said. "Edwin Holloway." Wolfe regarded her without expression. "The manufacturer?" he asked. "Yes. Holloway Precision Instruments." I knew the name. The company produced measuring devices, medical equipment, and enough specialized machinery to make Edwin Holloway wealthy without making him famous. He had lived in a stone house near the Hudson and appeared in newspapers mainly when donating money or refusing interviews. "My condolences," Wolfe said, in a tone that did not invite grief. "Thank you. While sorting his private papers, I found this." She opened the envelope and removed a photograph mounted on stiff gray card. She handed it to me because Wolfe does not accept objects from strangers when someone else is available. The picture showed 6 people standing on the broad steps of a country house. At least, it had once shown 6. 5 faces remained. The 6th had been cut out with care. The opening was oval, beginning above the collar and ending at the hairline. Whoever had removed the face had used a sharp blade and a patient hand. The body remained visible. It belonged to a slender person wearing a light summer coat. One hand rested on the stone railing. The other held a small dark object that might have been a book or a case. I placed the photograph on Wolfe's desk. He leaned forward half an inch. "When was this taken?" he asked. 25 years ago. At our family house in Briar Glen." "Who are the 5 visible people?" Margaret pointed from left to right. "My father, Edwin Holloway. My mother, Clara. My father's younger brother, Samuel. My aunt, Helen Mercer, who was my mother's sister. The man at the end is Walter Crane, my father's attorney. And the removed person, I do not know. Man or woman, I cannot be certain. The coat could belong to either. The figure is partly turned." I examined it again. The shoulders were narrow, the waist hidden by the coat, and the hands were gloved. Whoever had cut away the face had preserved every clue except the useful one. Wolfe said, "Where precisely did you find it?" "In a locked drawer in my father's study." "Who had the key?" "My father. After his death, the key was found on his watch chain." "What else was in the drawer?" "Old letters, property records, several bank books, and a small notebook. Nothing that explained the photograph. Was the face already removed? Yes. Why bring it to me? Margaret's fingers closed around the edge of her handbag. Because everyone in my family is lying. Wolfe leaned back. That is common. Specify. I first asked my mother. She said the photograph showed only the 5 people whose faces remain. When I pointed out the 6th body, she claimed she had never noticed it. Possible, I said. People overlook relatives for years. Margaret did not smile. My Uncle Samuel said the missing person was probably a servant. My Aunt Helen said it was a photographer's assistant. Walter Crane said he could not remember the day at all. 25 years is a substantial interval, Wolfe said. They remembered other details. My uncle remembered the weather. Aunt Helen remembered the dress she wore. Mr. Crane remembered that the picture was taken before lunch, but none of them remembered the 6th person. Wolfe's finger traced a small circle on the arm of his chair. Who took the photograph? A local photographer named Arthur Bell. His studio closed years ago. He died in 2018. Are there other copies? I searched the house. I found none. Did you ask the photographer's family? His son said the old negatives were destroyed in a fire. Wolfe closed his eyes briefly. What do you want from me? I want the missing person identified. That may be impossible. I will pay. That does not alter the past. No, but it may alter your interest. I approved of her answer. Wolfe opened his eyes. Why does the identity matter? Margaret looked at the photograph. Because my father was afraid of it. That held the room, she explained. That Edwin Holloway had been ill for 4 months before his death. His doctors had expected recovery, but his heart failed suddenly one night. 2 days before he died, Margaret entered his study and found him holding the photograph. He tried to hide it when he saw me, she said. I asked what it was. He said it was an old mistake. What were his exact words? Wolfe asked. He said, some faces are removed too late. I wrote it down. Did he say anything else? He asked whether I had ever seen the photograph. I said no. He told me to forget it. Did you? I am here. Wolfe grunted. What was the cause of death? Heart failure. Was an autopsy performed? No. His physician had treated him for a heart condition. Who found him? Walter Crane. That interested me more than it seemed to interest Wolfe. Why was the family attorney in the house at night? I asked. He had brought papers for my father to sign, he said. He found him collapsed beside the study desk. What papers? A revision to a family trust. Was it signed? No. Wolfe looked at the photograph again. Miss Holloway, your request concerns identification, but your anxiety concerns your father's death. Margaret hesitated. I do not know what concerns me. You suspect he was murdered? No. At least, I did not until I found the photograph. What changed? My father's notebook. She opened her handbag and removed a small black book. I took it and passed it to Wolfe after checking that it contained no explosives, insults, or grocery lists. Most pages held dates, telephone numbers, and short business notes. On the final written page, Edwin Holloway had recorded 6 lines. The picture remains. S refuses. H remembers more. WC has the copy. MH must never know. Ask about the silver case. Wolfe read the lines twice. You are MH, Margaret Holloway. Then your father did not want you to know. That is another reason I intend to. I pointed at the dark object in the missing figure's hand. A silver case? Margaret looked closely. It could be. Who are SH and WC? Wolfe asked. Samuel and Walter Crane. Did you confront them with the notebook? No. She looked surprised. Wolfe continued. People who have maintained a lie for 25 years should not be warned that the dead have left notes. You believe they are lying? I believe their claimed failure of memory is coordinated. That is different. He asked about the family. Samuel Holloway had worked beside Edwin until 10 years ago, when the brothers quarreled, and Samuel sold his interest in the company. He now lived in Connecticut and bred horses. Helen Mercer was a widow and lived in Manhattan. She had remained close to Clara Holloway, but rarely visited Edwin during his final year. Walter Crane had served as Edwin's attorney for nearly 30 years. He managed the Holloway trusts, property records, and family agreements. Clara Holloway remained at the Briar Glen house. According to Margaret, she had become nervous since Edwin's death and refused to enter his study. "Who inherits?" Wolfe asked. "My mother receives the house and income from the main trust. I inherit my father's company shares. Uncle Samuel receives nothing beyond an old settlement. Aunt Helen is not mentioned. And Walter Crane, he remains trustee. Unless the unsigned revision changed that. I have not seen it. Obtain a copy." Margaret shook her head. "Mr. Crane will refuse. Then Mr. Goodwin will ask in a manner designed to inconvenience refusal." "That is one of my specialties," I said. Wolfe ignored me. "Was anything else missing from the locked drawer?" "I cannot know. Was there dust?" "Yes, describe it." She frowned. The drawer was lined with green cloth. Most objects had left marks in the dust. Near the photograph was a narrow, empty space. "The size of what? A small box or case?" "Silver, possibly." Wolfe pushed the photograph toward me. "Archie, examine the cut." I used the magnifying lens from his desk. The cut had been made from the front. The blade had followed the outline of the face without touching the collar. Near the lower edge, a tiny strip of glossy paper remained beneath the mounting card. "The photograph may be layered," I said. Wolfe nodded. "Remove nothing. Take it to an expert." Margaret leaned forward. "You are accepting the case?" "I am accepting an inquiry. My fee will be $2,000 plus expenses. You will not question your relatives further, and you will not tell them you have engaged me." She agreed without bargaining. Wolfe disliked bargaining almost as much as leaving the house. He instructed me to photograph both sides of the picture, trace Arthur Bell's surviving business records, obtain the unsigned trust revision, and interview the 5 visible subjects separately. "What about the missing person?" I asked. "That is the object of the exercise. Man or woman? The left hand is gloved, but the wrist is narrow. The coat button's on the right. A woman's coat, usually." Margaret said my father had a sister named Lydia. That was the first time the name had appeared. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "You did not mention her. I never met her. She died before I was born." "How?" "I was told she drowned. When?" 24 years ago, the same year as the photograph." "Was her body recovered?" Wolfe asked. Margaret stared at him. "I do not know." "Who told you she drowned?" "My mother." "Uncle Samuel said Lydia ran away and was later reported dead. Aunt Helen refuses to discuss her." "And your father?" "He once told me he had no sister." Wolfe's lips pushed forward. "Your family has moved from poor memory to excess invention." I asked. "Could the missing face be Lydia's?" Margaret looked at the figure in the photograph. "Perhaps. Why remove her face, but leave her body?" Wolfe answered. "Because destroying the photograph would conceal nothing from someone who already knew it existed. Altering the face permitted the picture to survive while making identification uncertain." Margaret rose. "Then you think she may not have drowned?" "I think we have no reliable evidence that she did." The doorbell rang. I went to the hall. A delivery boy stood outside with a narrow package wrapped in brown paper. He said it was for Margaret Holloway and had been sent by messenger from Grand Central. "There is no sender," he added. I brought it into the office. Margaret went pale when she saw her name typed on the label. Wolfe told her not to touch it. I opened the wrapping carefully. Inside was a small silver cigarette case. Its surface was scratched, and one corner was darkened with age. On the lid were the engraved initials, L.H. Lydia Holloway. Margaret made a small sound. I pressed the clasp with a pencil. The case opened. There were no cigarettes inside, only a strip of photographic paper, folded once. I unfolded it and placed it beneath the office lamp. It showed the missing face. The woman was young, dark-haired, and unsmiling. Her eyes resembled Margaret's closely enough to settle the family connection. On the back, written in fresh black ink, were 7 words. She was alive when Wynne died. No one spoke for several seconds. Wolfe looked at the silver case, the restored face, and Margaret Holloway. "Archie," he said. "Telephone Inspector Kramer." Margaret gripped the arms of her chair. Why the police? 'Cause someone knew you brought the photograph here. Someone possessed the missing face. And the object named in your father's notebook. That person has chosen to announce that a woman declared dead 25 years ago survived until at least 3 weeks ago. He leaned back and closed his eyes. Your request was to identify the person removed from the photograph. That question is answered. Margaret swallowed. Then, what is the case now? Wolfe opened his eyes. To discover who removed her, why your father concealed her survival, and whether Edwin Holloway died before he could reveal a second crime. The old photograph lay beneath the office lamp, 5 faces still attached, and one returned after 25 years. Someone in the Holloway family had spent nearly a generation cutting Lydia out of its history. That morning, Lydia had cut her way back in. Chapter 2. A forgotten relative family secrets improve with age in the same way milk does. By noon the next day, I was driving north toward Briar Glen with the altered photograph in a protective envelope, the silver cigarette case in my inside pocket, and instructions from Nero Wolfe that would have occupied a committee. Observe, he had said. I occasionally do not accuse anyone. That reduces the entertainment. Obtain contradictions. Truth may be hidden, but a lie must be maintained. Maintenance produces errors. He had also ordered me to examine Edwin Holloway's study, locate the unsigned trust revision, learn who had known Margaret was visiting us, and determine whether Lydia Holloway had drowned, disappeared, or merely offended her family beyond the reach of grammar. Inspector Kramer had sent a man to collect the wrapping paper and photographic strip from the silver case. No useful fingerprints had been found. The delivery boy had received the package from a man near Grand Central who wore a hat low over his eyes and paid in cash. That description included half the male population of Manhattan. The Holloway estate stood above the Hudson, behind iron gates and old trees. The house was grey stone, broad across the front, and arranged to make a visitor feel that his ancestors had chosen badly. Margaret met me at the door. You did not tell them I was coming, I asked. No. Do they know about the silver case? Only my mother. She heard me telephoning the police. That makes one person too many, but we will manage. She took me through a high entrance hall, where portraits watched from the walls. Most of the painted Holloways appeared to have objected to being born. Clara Holloway waited in the drawing room. She was a slender woman in her early 60s, with white hair, a straight back, and the careful hands of someone who had spent a lifetime controlling their movement. Her eyes went first to the envelope under my arm. You have brought the photograph back. For the moment. I told Margaret it proves nothing. It proves there were 6 people on the steps. 6 bodies. The face may have belonged to anyone. Your sister-in-law, Lydia? Clara's fingers tightened. Lydia was not Edwin's sister. Margaret stared at her. You told me she was. I said she was treated like family. I sat opposite Clara. Yesterday, I said, Miss Holloway told Mr. Wolfe that her father had a sister named Lydia. Today you say Lydia was not his sister. Which version would you like written down? Clara turned toward Margaret. You misunderstood me. Margaret's voice was cold. I did not. Clara looked back at me. Lydia was a distant relative, a cousin perhaps. Edwin's mother brought her into the house after her parents died. Perhaps it was long ago. What was her full name? Lydia Holloway. Convenient for a distant cousin. Clara rose and moved toward the window. She was unstable. She created quarrels. Eventually she left. Did she drown? I heard she did. Who told you? Edwin. Did you see a death certificate? No. A body? No. Then you accepted the death of a woman living in your house without seeing either. Clara turned. People accepted what Edwin told them. There was more truth in that sentence than in everything else she had said. I showed her a copy of the restored face from the silver case. Is this Lydia? She looked at it for 3 seconds. Yes. Who cut her face from the photograph? I do not know. Who owns the original missing section? I do not know. Who sent the silver case to Mr. Wolfe's office? I do not know. She delivered the three answers in the same tone. Rehearsal rarely improves a lie, but it makes it easier to identify. Who is Daniel Holloway? I asked. It was a trial balloon. I had no Daniel yet, only Wolfe's advice that an unexpected name often loosened a witness. Clara's face changed. Not much, but enough. I have never heard the name. Margaret looked from her mother to me. Neither have I. I stood. That is useful. Clara demanded to know why. I told her it was useful because she had answered too quickly. Samuel Holloway was in Edwin's study. He had arrived that morning from Connecticut after learning the police had visited the estate. Samuel was 58, compact, red-faced, and dressed in country clothes that had cost more than most city suits. He stood beside Edwin's desk with a glass in his hand. "You are Wolfe's man," he said. Among other distinctions, my niece had no business involving a private detective. Someone sent us Lydia's cigarette case. That made the business less private. Samuel drank. So it was Lydia. You recognize the initials. Everyone did. Your sister, cousin. Your sister-in-law says distant relative. That is what a cousin is. How distant? He frowned. Second cousin. Perhaps third. Clara said Lydia had been brought into the household as an orphan. That sounds right. Margaret says Edwin once called her his sister. Edwin said many things. So far, Lydia has been a sister, a second cousin, a third cousin, and an orphan of uncertain origin. She had an active family life. Samuel placed his glass on the desk. She was trouble. That is all you need to know. Trouble usually has details. She made accusations against Edwin. She claimed he had cheated someone. Who? I do not remember. Daniel Holloway? The color receded from his face. It was a better reaction than Clara's. There was no Daniel Holloway, he said. I did not ask whether there was. Samuel realized it and reached for his glass. Who was he? I asked. A name Lydia invented. Why? To support her accusations. What accusations? Samuel stared at the liquor. That Edwin had stolen property belonging to Daniel. What property? I do not know. Company shares? No. Land? No. Money? I said I do not know. He was lying in smaller and smaller pieces. I moved to Edwin's desk. It was dark walnut, wide enough to conduct a minor war. The locked drawer Margaret had opened stood at the lower right. Green cloth lined the interior. Dust marks showed where papers, bank books, the photograph, and a narrow rectangular object had rested. The silver case fit the empty mark exactly. Samuel watched me place it there. Where did you get that? You recognized it before I said what it was. Lydia carried it constantly. Then you remember her better than you admit. He turned toward the door. I said, Did Edwin remove Daniel from the family records? Samuel stopped. There was no Daniel. Clara said the same thing. For once she is right. He left without his glass. Aunt Helen Mercer arrived before lunch. She was Clara's younger sister, not a Holloway by birth, but she had been in the photograph, and apparently close enough to the secret to lie about it. Helen was brisk, well-dressed and nervous. She told me the missing woman had been a companion employed by Edwin's mother. Clara, says cousin, I told her. She may have been both. Samuel says second or third cousin. Then ask Samuel. I did. He became thirsty. Helen refused to identify the silver case, but looked directly at the initials before claiming she had never seen it. I tried Daniel's name. Her response was silence. Miss Mercer, you should leave old matters alone. That advice usually means the matter is still alive. Daniel was nobody. That is an improvement over not existing. She sat near the window. He was related to Edwin's father. An illegitimate son, I believe. Edwin's half-brother? I do not know. You just said he was related to Edwin's father. I heard rumors. Was Lydia related to Daniel? Helen pressed her lips together. Lydia believed she was. That sentence was built to avoid a fact. His daughter? No. His sister? Helen looked toward the hall. Ask Walter Crane. That was the first sensible suggestion anyone had made. Before leaving the room, she said, Lydia was not removed from that photograph because she was hated. Why, then? Because Edwin was afraid someone would recognize her. Who? Helen left without answering. Lunch at the Holloway estate was a quiet contest between expensive food and poor conversation. Clara ate almost nothing. Samuel had another drink. Helen did not appear. Margaret watched all of them and learned what it feels like to discover that your childhood was edited. Afterward, Margaret took me to the attic. My father stored family papers there, she said. Mother wants them burned. That recommends them. The attic contained trunks, boxes, furniture, and 30 years of dust. We found 2 family Bibles, 3 photograph albums, old account books, and a wooden document chest with a broken lock. One album had several pages removed. Another contained photographs of Edwin, Samuel, and Lydia as children. Beneath one picture, a name had been scratched away. The surviving caption read, Edwin, Lydia, Samuel, and D. Margaret touched the damaged line. Daniel. Likely. The 4 children stood beside a lake. Daniel appeared to be the oldest, perhaps 14. He was tall, dark-haired, and serious. Lydia stood close beside him, one hand on his arm. Your family did not merely forget him, I said. Someone revised the album. In the document chest we found letters tied with faded cord. Most concerned household expenses, school terms, and Edwin's early work at the instrument company. 3 letters, mentioned Daniel. The first was from Edwin's mother to her husband. Daniel has returned from school and asks again about the shares. He has found the old agreement. Edwin must not provoke him. The second, written 2 years later, was from Lydia to Samuel. Daniel says the company was built with his money as well as father's. Edwin denies it, but I saw the signed paper. The third had no signature. It was addressed to Lydia. If Daniel appears at Briar Glen, tell him the settlement stands. He surrendered his name and claim. Nothing remains for him here. Margaret read it twice. Surrendered his name? Families with enough money can make surrender sound voluntary. At the bottom of the chest lay a folded family genealogy. 3 names appeared beneath: Charles and Beatrice Holloway, Daniel Holloway, Edwin Holloway, Samuel Holloway. Lydia's name had been added in another hand beside them, with no connecting line. Then someone had crossed out Daniel so heavily that the paper had nearly torn. Margaret sat on an old trunk. My father had an older brother. It appears so. Why was I never told? Because questions reproduce. We heard a floorboard creak in the corridor. I reached the door in time to see a figure disappearing toward the attic stairs. I followed, but by the time I reached the 2nd floor, the corridor was empty. Margaret came behind me carrying the letters. Who was it? Someone who does not approve of genealogy. We returned to the attic. The old photograph album was gone. Whoever had listened outside had taken the picture showing Daniel, Edwin, Lydia, and Samuel as children. The letters remained because Margaret had them in her hand. At 3:30, I telephoned Wolfe from Edwin's study. He listened while I reported the various versions of Lydia's relationship, the reactions to Daniel's name, the letters, the genealogy, and the stolen album. When I finished, he said, "The family erased Daniel before it erased Lydia. That seems to be the order. Why?" Daniel claimed ownership of company shares. Lydia supported him. Edwin opposed both. Insufficient. For forgetting a brother? For preserving the lie through another generation. Money may begin such a deceit, but fear maintains it. I looked at the green-lined drawer. The silver case had been kept beside the photograph. Yes, Edwin knew Lydia was alive. He may also have known where Daniel went. Perhaps. What do I do next? Mr. Crane. Walter Crane is in Manhattan. He is not. Saul reports that he left his office this morning and drove toward Briar Glen. I glanced through the study window. A dark sedan was coming up the drive. Excellent timing. Do not praise chance. It becomes conceited. The line went dead. Walter Crane entered the study 10 minutes later. He wore a dark coat, carried a leather briefcase, and looked exactly as a family attorney should look when arriving to prevent facts from becoming public. His eyes went to the open drawer. "What have you taken?" he asked. "Only an interest. Those papers belong to the estate. Then you can identify Daniel Holloway for the estate inventory." Crane's face remained composed. Daniel died as a child. The letters say he attended school, owned company shares, signed a settlement, and threatened to appear at Briar Glen. Family letters are unreliable. So are family lawyers. Margaret entered carrying the genealogy. Crane looked at the crossed-out name. "Where did you find that?" "In the attic," she said. "Who was Daniel?" Crane placed his briefcase on the desk. "Your grandfather had a son before he married your grandmother. Daniel was raised in the household for a time. Later, he accepted money and left." "Was he Edwin's half-brother?" "Yes." "Why was his name erased?" "He tried to take control of the company through forged documents." Lydia believed the documents were genuine, I said. Crane's eyes shifted toward me. Lydia believed many things. Did she leave with Daniel? No. Did Daniel die? I was told he did. By whom? Edwin. The answer had become popular. Crane opened his briefcase and removed a folder. "This is the unsigned trust revision you requested." I took it. The document would have removed Crane as trustee and transferred control to Margaret immediately upon Edwin's death. It also ordered the release of a sealed file labeled DH. "Where is the sealed file?" I asked. Crane looked at the document as if seeing the clause for the first time. "No such file exists." "You prepared this." "Edwin dictated it." "Then what did DH mean?" "I assumed it referred to a business account." "Daniel Holloway?" Crane closed the briefcase. "There is nothing more I can tell you." He turned toward the door. Margaret said, "Mr. Crane, my father wrote that you had a copy of the photograph." Crane stopped. For the first time, his control broke. It lasted only a second, but a second is generous when a man has spent 30 years training his face. "I have no copy," he said. "Then how did you know which photograph she meant?" I asked. He left without answering. At 5, I drove back to Manhattan with the letters, genealogy, trust revision, and a new respect for the Holloway talent for removing people from paper. Wolfe was in the office when I arrived. Dinner smells drifted in from the kitchen, and he looked resentful when I spread the documents across his desk. He read the letters, examined the crossed-out genealogy, and studied the DH clause in the unsigned trust. "Daniel was not forgotten," he said. "He was suppressed. Edwin's older half-brother, possibly cheated out of company shares. And Lydia supported his claim. Yes, therefore the alteration of her photograph may not concern her identity alone. Her presence connected the others to Daniel." I sat at my desk. "Crane says Daniel died. Mr. Crane says many things only after discovering that silence is no longer available." The telephone rang, I answered. Man's voice said, "Goodwin?" "Yes. You are looking for Daniel Holloway. Who is this?" "You will find what remains of him beneath the old boathouse at Briar Glen." The connection ended. I held the receiver for a moment, then repeated the message. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Telephone Inspector Kramer," he said. "You think there is a body?" "I think someone fears we may find one." I reached for the dial. The Holloway family had erased Daniel's name from its records, scratched it from photographs, denied his blood, and converted his life into a rumor. Now an unknown caller had given us a place to look. Beneath the old boathouse, family history was waiting to be dug up. Chapter 3. The man who vanished. Inspector Kramer disliked anonymous telephone calls, country estates, old family scandals, and being summoned before breakfast. The Holloway case supplied all four before 9 o'clock. At 8:15 the next morning, I was in a police car heading north with Kramer and Sergeant Pearlie Stebbins. Kramer sat beside me with an unlit cigar and the expression of a man who suspected the scenery of withholding evidence. "You get one call," he said, "from a man who says there is a body under a boathouse, and Wolfe sends you digging." "Wolfe sent me observing. You brought the digging equipment." The caller could be a crank. He knew we were looking for Daniel Holloway. So does half the Holloway family. That reduces the field from New York to one. "Wealthy household," Kramer grunted. The Hudson was gray beneath a low sky. Bare trees crowded the road, their branches wet from the night's rain. By the time we reached Briar Glen, 2 county officers were waiting at the gates. Clara Holloway's house had not improved overnight. It still looked as if it had been built to survive both weather and affection. Margaret met us in the entrance hall. "My mother is furious," she said. "Then she is awake," I replied. Clara Holloway appeared on the stairs before we could remove our coats. "There will be no excavation," she announced. Kramer looked up at her. "There will, if I say so. This is private property. That is why I brought paper." He produced a search order and held it where she could see the official stamp. Clara's face tightened. "The caller lied," she said. "There is nothing beneath the boathouse." Kramer put the paper back in his pocket. "How do you know?" "I have lived here for 37 years. So has the boathouse." She descended the final steps. "Daniel left this country 25 years ago. He did not die here." "Where did he go?" I asked. "South which country?" "I do not remember." "Argentina," I suggested. "Possibly. Brazil, perhaps? Convenient continent. Plenty of room." Kramer told her to remain available. She turned and walked toward the drawing room, carrying her anger like a tray she intended to serve later. The old boathouse stood at the bottom of a wooded slope behind the estate. Its roof sagged, its windows were broken, and one side leaned toward the river, as though tired of land. George, the estate caretaker, unlocked it. He was a long, weathered man in his 60s who claimed he had worked at Briar Glen for only 14 years. That put his arrival, 11 years after Daniel disappeared, and made him nearly useless, which seemed to please him. Inside were 2 rotting rowboats, coils of rope, broken tools, and enough damp wood to discourage fire. The floor was laid in wide planks. Near the rear wall, several boards were newer than the rest. Kramer pointed at them. "When?" George rubbed his jaw. "Before my time." The county men lifted the boards. Beneath them lay packed earth. We dug. There is no elegant way to watch men search for an old corpse. The work is slow, dirty, and full of moments when everyone sees a bone that becomes a root. After 40 minutes, one of the men struck metal. They uncovered a narrow tin box, or rusted along the edges but still closed. No body. Kramer looked at me. "Your caller promised remains. He said we would find what remained of Daniel. He may have had a literary education." The box was carried into the boathouse and opened with a pry bar. Inside were 3 objects wrapped in oilcloth. The first was a man's wallet, dark brown and badly cracked. It contained no money, but behind one torn pocket was a card bearing the name Daniel Holloway. The second was a silver watch engraved with the initials DH. The third was a folded agreement. The paper had survived because of the oilcloth, though water had stained its edges. It was dated 25 years earlier and concerned the transfer of shares in Holloway Precision Instruments. Under its terms, Daniel Holloway surrendered all claim to 30% of the company in exchange for $50,000. 2 signatures appeared at the bottom. Daniel Holloway, Walter Crane. Kramer studied the page. "Crane witnessed it, or created it," I said. The signature attributed to Daniel was broad and uneven. I remembered the letters in the attic. Daniel's childhood writing had been firm and narrow, but handwriting changes between 14 and adulthood, especially when $50,000 is nearby. A handwritten line appeared beneath the signatures. "Payment completed. DH departed April 18. "Departed where?" Pearlie asked. The agreement did not say. Kramer turned to the caretaker. "Who knew this box was here?" George raised both hands. "Not me." "Who replaced the floorboards before my time?" The earth around the box showed no recent disturbance except ours. Whatever had been buried there had waited for years. The anonymous caller had not sent us to a fresh hiding place. He had sent us to a preserved piece of family history, or to a manufactured one. Kramer sealed the objects for examination. "I telephoned Wolfe from the estate kitchen," he answered, after Fritz located him in the plant rooms. "No body," I reported. "A tin box containing Daniel's wallet, his watch, and an agreement surrendering company shares for $50,000. Walter Crane witnessed the signature. A note says, "Daniel departed April 18th. Where was the box?" buried beneath the boathouse floor. An unusual place for proof of voluntary departure. That occurred to me. Who benefits from its discovery? Crane, Edwin's memory, and anyone claiming Daniel took the money and ran. Then its discovery may have been arranged for precisely that purpose. 25 years in advance? No, its burial may be old. The telephone call is new. I leaned against the kitchen table. You think someone wants us to accept the settlement as the explanation. I think someone wants us to stop looking for Daniel's body. That implies there is one. It implies fear that we may search for one. He instructed me to learn whether the $50,000 had ever been paid, whether Daniel possessed a passport, and whether any ship, airline, bank, or government had recorded his presence after April 18th. Saul can handle records faster. Saul is already doing so. You will handle people who are slower and less reliable. He hung up. Walter Crane arrived at Briar Glen at 11:30. Either Clara had called him, or lawyers naturally sense when old agreements are being removed from the ground. Kramer showed him the document in the drawing room. Crane examined it without touching. I remember this, he said. Good memory, I told him. Yesterday, Daniel had died as a child. I said I had been told that. I did not say when. That is a sentence only a lawyer could enjoy. Kramer asked him about the settlement. Crane said Daniel had threatened to sue Edwin and their father over ownership of company shares. The dispute was settled privately. Daniel accepted $50,000 and agreed to leave New York. Where did he go? Kramer asked. I believe Argentina. Proof? Edwin later received a letter from Buenos Aires. Where is it? I do not know. Did you see Daniel sign the agreement? Yes. Did you see him receive the money? No. Edwin handled payment. Cash, I believe. Kramer glanced at me. A cash payment was the natural friend of a dead witness. Why bury the agreement under the boathouse? I asked. Crane looked genuinely surprised. It was buried, along with Daniel's wallet and watch. I knew nothing about that. Why would a man leaving for another continent abandon his wallet? He may have obtained another. And his watch? I cannot explain it. His passport. Crane's face shifted. He had one. You saw it? Edwin said he did. Edwin had become the family's official source for events no one could prove, I said. Who was the silver-haired woman standing beside Daniel in the old photograph album? Crane looked at me sharply. There was no such woman. I had invented her. Thank you, I said. For what? For confirming you saw the album before it disappeared. He recovered quickly. I assumed you meant Lydia. I did not mention Lydia. Crane turned to Kramer. Am I under arrest? No, Kramer said. But don't go anywhere that requires a passport. Crane left the room with dignity. It was slightly damaged but still serviceable. Samuel Holloway was next, he admitted. Daniel had disputed the inheritance, but claimed the matter concerned only money left by their father, not company shares. How much inheritance? I asked. About $50,000. The agreement says he surrendered 30% of Holloway Precision Instruments. Samuel frowned. Then the agreement is false. You said yesterday that Daniel forged documents claiming company ownership. He did. Now you say the settlement recognizing that claim is false. I said I had not seen it. Did Daniel leave for South America? Samuel walked to the drinks table. Yes. Did you see him leave? No. Did he write once? From where? Buenos Aires. Do you have the letter? No. Did you recognize his handwriting? I was 19. I did not study it. Was Lydia with him? The bottle stopped above the glass. No. Did she leave around the same time? A few weeks later. Where? I do not know. Did Edwin tell you she drowned? Yes. Where? Samuel poured the drink. He never said. I sat on the arm of a chair. Your older brother disappears. A woman close to him vanishes weeks later. Edwin tells you one went to Argentina and the other drowned, and you ask no questions. Samuel drank. You did not know Edwin. I am beginning to. His eyes became hard. Daniel hated him. Lydia encouraged Daniel. They wanted to take the company apart. Was Daniel violent? No. Was Edwin? Samuel's silence answered before his mouth did. Edwin did what was necessary, he said. I wrote that down. Helen Mercer arrived after 1. Her story differed from Samuel's before she had removed her gloves. Daniel had not gone to Argentina. According to Helen, he had sailed to England to locate his mother's relatives. Clara says South America, I told her. Clara believed what Edwin told her. Samuel says Buenos Aires. Samuel repeats what protects Samuel. Walter Crane says Argentina too. Walter repeats what protects Walter. That was not denial. It was a map. Helen admitted Lydia had searched for Daniel after his disappearance. She had visited banks, steamship offices, and police stations. Edwin became furious and forbade her to return to Briar Glen. What did Lydia believe happened? I asked. She believed Daniel never left. Why? His clothes were still here. His passport was in Edwin's desk. That was the fact the others had avoided. You saw the passport? Yes. When? 2 days after Daniel supposedly departed. Lydia showed it to me. What happened to it? Edwin took it from her. Did Lydia tell the police? She tried. Walter Crane persuaded them it was a family dispute. Did you see Daniel after April 18th? Helen looked down at her hands. I saw someone in the boathouse that night. Someone? A man. Edwin and Samuel were with him. Was it Daniel? I could not see his face. It was dark. What happened? There was shouting. Later, I heard a motorcar leave. Whose car? Edwin's. What time? Near midnight. Did it return? Before dawn. Who drove? Edwin. Was Samuel with him? Yes. Helen shook her head. I did not see anyone else. That was not proof of murder, but it was close enough to make the room colder. Why have you kept silent for 25 years? Because Edwin said Daniel had attacked him and fled. Walter said the matter was settled. Clara begged me not to destroy the family. And Lydia? She refused to be silent. What happened to her? I do not know. Do you believe she drowned? No. Do you believe she is alive, Helen? Looked toward the doorway before answering. I did not until the silver case appeared. Kramer took her full statement. Afterward, he ordered a search of the estate grounds, old wells, storage buildings, and the wooded road leading away from the boathouse. 25 years had reduced the odds, but it had not eliminated them. At 3, Saul telephoned the estate. I have been looking for Daniel Holloway, he said. Have you checked Argentina? Everyone else has sent him there. No passport was issued to him under that name. No immigration record shows his entry into Argentina, Brazil, England, Canada, or Mexico. No ship manifest lists him leaving New York during the 6 months after April 18th. Maybe he used another name. Possible, but there is no evidence. There is also no death certificate. What about the $50,000? Edwin withdrew $50,000 in cash on April 17th. The next morning he redeposited $48,500. I straightened. So, Daniel received $1,500, or Edwin spent $1,500 elsewhere. The settlement amount was never paid. What about Daniel's bank accounts? No activity after April 17th. His balance remained untouched for 7 years. Then Edwin obtained control through a court declaration that Daniel was missing. Who filed it? Walter Crane. Who inherited Daniel's interest? Edwin and Samuel. Edwin received most of it. There it was. The inheritance dispute had not ended with a payment. It had ended with Daniel disappearing and Edwin acquiring what Daniel claimed. Saul had found one more thing. A local garage had kept old account books. On the morning of April 19th, Edwin paid to have mud removed from his motor car and a damaged rear fender repaired. Cause of the damage? The entry says impact with stone or timber. Where was the garage? 6 miles north of Briar Glen. Near the river road? Yes. I thanked him and called Wolfe. He listened without interruption while I reported the false settlement, the returned cash, the absent passport, the lack of travel records, Helen's sighting at the boathouse, the midnight motorcar trip, and Edwin's damaged fender. When I finished, Wolfe said, Daniel Holloway did not vanish. You are ready to declare that. I am ready to reject the family's explanation. He did not receive the settlement. He did not take his wallet, watch, passport, clothes or bank funds. No independent witness saw him leave. The evidence of departure was supplied entirely by Edwin and Mr. Crane. Then Daniel was killed at Briar Glen, possibly. Do not promote inference to fact. Samuel and Edwin took the car out after the argument. Edwin returned before dawn. The car was repaired the next morning. Yes, they may have transported a body. Yes, where? That is the relevant question. The boathouse stood beside the river. But if a body had been put into the Hudson, little would remain after 25 years. The car suggested they had carried something away instead. Why bury Daniel's wallet and watch beneath the boathouse? I asked. To create evidence of abandonment, if required, or to conceal items he would never willingly leave. And the agreement? To provide a legal explanation for his disappearance. Then the box was Edwin's insurance. More likely Mr. Crane's. The language is his, and he witnessed the signature. You think Daniel's signature was forged? Have it examined. Before I hung up, Wolfe added, find the original inheritance records, not copies prepared by Mr. Crane. That proved difficult. The family safe contained tax records, deeds, and company papers, but no original will from Charles Holloway, Edwin and Daniel's father. Walter Crane claimed it had been filed with the county court. The court copy showed Edwin and Samuel as the only sons, yet the old genealogy named Daniel first. Margaret and I searched Edwin's study again. Behind a row of business ledgers, she found a thin volume bound in black leather. It was a household account book maintained by Edwin's mother. Most entries concerned servants, repairs, and school expenses. One page, dated a month before Daniel vanished, contained a private note. Charles's final paper must be honored. Daniel is the eldest and owns 1/3 of the company. Edwin has no right to deny him. Walter says the earlier will can be substituted, but I will not consent. Margaret read it aloud. An earlier will, she said. Crane replaced the final one, or intended to. On the next page, the writing changed. Daniel has found the signed copy. Lydia helped him. Edwin knows. The remaining pages had been cut out. We heard a sound in the corridor. This time I moved faster. I opened the study door and caught Clara Holloway with one hand raised toward the knob. She stood perfectly still. What are you doing? Margaret asked. Clara looked at the black book in her daughter's hands. I came to stop you. From learning about Daniel, from destroying what remains of this family, I said. Where did Edwin and Samuel take him that night? Her eyes moved to me. I do not know. You knew his passport was still here, yes. You knew the settlement was false, I suspected. You knew Edwin lied about Argentina. Yes, Margaret stared at her mother. Then why did you repeat it? Clara's control finally gave way. Because I was carrying you. The room went silent. Margaret's voice was barely audible. What? I was pregnant. Edwin said, if the scandal became public, the company would collapse and we would lose everything. He said, Daniel had attacked Samuel and fled. I wanted to believe him. Did you see Daniel after the argument? No. Did you see Lydia? 2 weeks later. She came to the house at night. Margaret gripped the account book. What did she want? She wanted Edwin to confess. She said she had proof Daniel had not left voluntarily. What proof? Clara looked at the silver case in my hand. A photograph. I took out the altered picture. This one? No, another photograph. It showed Edwin's car near the old quarry the morning after Daniel disappeared. Who took it? I do not know. What happened to it? Edwin took it from Lydia. And Lydia? She left that night. Did she return? Not while I lived here. Clara turned toward Margaret. I told you she drowned because Edwin said it was safer. I never knew whether it was true. Her face had aged during the conversation. Where is the old quarry? I asked. North of the estate, beyond the abandoned mill road. Kramer had county officers there within an hour. The quarry had been closed for 30 years. Rainwater filled its deepest section, and brush covered the slopes. Near the upper road, an officer found rusted metal half buried beneath leaves. It was part of an automobile bumper. The serial markings were faint but readable. The manufacturer's records would tell us whether it belonged to Edwin's car. As darkness gathered over Briar Glen, Floodlights were brought to the quarry. Search teams examined the brush, the water, and the crumbling ground near the old access road. No body was found that night. But near the edge of the flooded pit, Pearlie discovered a single corroded metal object trapped between two rocks. A belt buckle. On its face was the Holloway family crest. Margaret identified it from childhood photographs. Daniel had worn a belt with that buckle on the day he disappeared. Kramer sealed it in an evidence bag. I telephoned Wolfe one final time from the Holloway drawing room. The quarry produced Daniel's belt buckle and part of an old automobile bumper. No body yet. Enough, Wolfe said. Enough for what? To know that the story of voluntary departure was manufactured. You think Edwin killed him? I think Daniel confronted Edwin with proof of his inheritance. A struggle followed. Edwin and Samuel removed him from the estate. Mr. Crane supplied the false agreement and later altered the legal record. And Lydia knew. Yes, that is why her face was cut away. She was not merely a forgotten relative. She was a witness. I looked at the photograph on the table. Was she in the group picture before or after Daniel vanished? To determine the date precisely. The clothing, weather, house repairs, or photographer's records may provide it. Arthur Bell's negatives burned. Negatives are not the only records a photographer keeps. Wolfe paused. Archie, Daniel's disappearance explains why the family feared Lydia. It does not explain why Edwin kept her cigarette case beside the altered photograph for 24 years. Guilt? Possibly. Or communication. You think Lydia contacted him? I think she remained alive long enough to make him afraid. The line clicked dead. Outside, police lights moved among the trees above the quarry. Inside, the Holloway family stood in separate rooms, each guarding a different piece of the same lie. Daniel Holloway had no death certificate because no one had reported his death. He had no travel record because he had never left. He had no place in the family history because Edwin, Samuel, and Walter Crane had made his disappearance profitable. For 25 years they had called him a man who ran away. Now the evidence suggested he had been carried. Chapter 4. The New Murder. A second corpse is a detective's way of being told that the first set of questions was correct. The morning after Daniel Holloway's belt buckle came out of the abandoned quarry, I was in Edwin Holloway's study with Margaret, examining old household accounts and wondering how many crimes could be concealed by respectable stationery. Rain tapped the windows. Police officers still moved through the grounds below, searching the road between Briar Glen and the quarry. Inspector Kramer had returned to Manhattan before dawn, leaving Pearlie Stebbins to supervise the work. At 9:20, the telephone rang. Margaret answered it. She listened for perhaps 5 seconds, then gripped the receiver. What happened? Her face changed. I'll come at once. She replaced the receiver and turned to me. Henry is dead. Henry who? Henry Holloway. My grandfather's younger brother. Everyone calls him Uncle Henry, though he is technically my great-uncle. That repaired one branch of the Holloway family tree while breaking another. Where? At Ashcroft House, 3 miles from here. His housekeeper found him in the library. How old? 82. Healthy? Healthy enough to spend morning complaining about people younger than 70. Who called? His housekeeper, Mrs. Ward. I took my hat. Tell Pearlie. Then we will go before anyone decides natural causes are more convenient. Ashcroft House stood beyond the village on a rise overlooking the river. It was smaller than Briar Glen but older, built of dark stone with narrow windows and chimneys that looked prepared to defend themselves. A county police car was already outside. Mrs. Ward admitted us. She was a square woman in black, around 60. With grey hair and the rigid expression of someone who had found death in a room she intended to keep tidy. He is in the library, she said. Has anything been touched? I asked. Only the glass. Dr. Nolan moved it to smell the contents. Where is Dr. Nolan? With Mr. Holloway. Margaret started toward the library. I stopped her. Stay here until the police finish looking. He was my family. At the moment, that makes you a witness. She did not like it, but she remained in the hall. The library smelled of wood smoke, leather bindings, and bitter almonds. That last item made me stop inside the door. Henry Holloway sat in a high-backed chair near the fireplace. He was thin, white-haired, and dressed in a dark wool jacket. His chin rested against his chest. One hand lay on the chair arm, and the other hung toward the carpet. A book had fallen open beside his shoe. On the small table near him stood a glass containing a little amber liquid. Dr. Nolan, a heavy man with tired eyes, was bending over the body. "Heart?" I asked. He turned. "Who are you?" "Archie Goodwin, Nero Wolfe's investigator. That is not a medical qualification." "No, but I can smell almonds." His expression changed. He looked at the glass. I noticed an odor. Cyanide, possibly. "Do not touch anything." I had planned to leave that privilege to the police. A young county officer stood near the window, looking uncomfortable. I told him to telephone Inspector Kramer and request the medical examiner. He hesitated until I mentioned the possible poison. Then he moved. I examined the room without touching it. There were 2 doors, one from the main hall and another leading to a narrow passage toward the dining room. The windows were latched from inside. A fire burned low in the grate. On the desk lay a silver tray, a water pitcher, a decanter, and 3 glasses. Only one glass had been used. A leather photograph album lay open beside the decanter. One page had been cut out. I went closer. The cut was recent. Small white fibers stood along the inner edge where the heavy paper had been sliced away. On the opposite page remained 4 triangular corner mounts that had once held a photograph. Dr. Nolan noticed what I was examining. "That album was closed when I saw him yesterday," he said. "You were here yesterday, at 5. Charles had complained of dizziness. Did he drink then?" "Tea. Mrs. Ward served it. What did you diagnose?" "Fatigue and high blood pressure. Nothing that suggested immediate danger." "What time do you think he died?" "Late last night, perhaps between 10 and midnight. That is only an estimate." "Who saw him alive last?" "Mrs. Ward, I believe." I returned to the body. Charles's face was grey. There was no sign of struggle. The fallen book was a history of the Holloway Company, privately printed 20 years earlier. A folded strip of paper projected from its pages. Using a pencil, I opened the book farther. The paper contained 4 handwritten words. The photograph was wrong. Below them was a date, April 18, the day Daniel Holloway had supposedly left the country. Dr. Nolan leaned closer. "Is that his writing?" I was about to ask. Mrs. Ward identified it from the doorway. "Yes, Mr. Holloway wrote that." "When?" I asked. "I do not know." "Did he own an old family photograph showing Edwin's, Samuel, Lydia, and Daniel?" Her eyes moved toward the open album. "There were many photographs. 1 page is missing. I did not remove it." "Who had access to this room, Mr. Holloway?" "Myself, his secretary, and family visitors." "Name the visitors during the past week." She hesitated. "Walter Crane came on Monday. Samuel Holloway came Tuesday afternoon. Miss Mercer came yesterday morning." "Helen Merce. Anyone else?" "Edwin's widow telephoned, but she did not visit." "What about Margaret?" "Not for several months. Margaret stood behind her in the hall and heard that." I asked Mrs. Ward about the previous evening. "Charles dined alone at 7:30. At 9, she brought his usual drink to the library." "What was it?" "Whiskey with a little water." "Did you pour it?" "From that decanter?" "Yes." "Did you drink from it?" "No." "Who else had access to the decanter?" "Anyone in the house." "Was Mr. Holloway alone after 9, as far as I know?" "That is not the same as yes." She straightened. "I retired to my room at 9:30. His secretary had already gone." "Name?" "Robert Lane." "When did Lane leave?" "Shortly after 8. "Did Charles receive a telephone call?" "Yes." "At 8:40. From whom?" "I do not know," he answered in the library. "Did you hear anything?" "Only his voice." He became angry. "What did he say?" Mrs. Ward looked at Margaret and then back at me. He said, "Daniel is dead because Edwin was a coward." The room seemed to shrink. "Anything else?" he said. "I kept the picture because someday it would be needed." Then he closed the door. Did anyone arrive afterward? I heard the front bell around 9:15. Who answered it? Mr. Holloway. He had told me not to disturb him. You did not see the visitor? No. Did you hear the person leave? I heard the side door close, perhaps 20 minutes later. The side passage from the library led toward that door. Man or woman? I could not tell. Inspector Kramer arrived at 10:40, bringing Pearlie, 2 laboratory men, and a mood that made the county officers look happier to surrender authority. He found me beside the open album. Goodwin, he said. You collect bodies now? I arrived after this one. That is what you always say. I gave him the facts, the smell from the glass, the fresh cut in the album, the note in the book, the visitors, the unknown caller and the unseen guest. Kramer ordered the house sealed, and the glass, decanter, pitcher, book and album photographed and collected. The medical examiner arrived before 11. A rapid test on the drink suggested cyanide. The laboratory would confirm it, but no one continued discussing natural causes. Kramer looked at Margaret. Why would anyone kill your great-uncle? I do not know. Did he know about Daniel? He must have. He was my grandfather's younger brother. Did you speak to him after finding the photograph? No. Did he know Wolfe was investigating? I told my mother. She may have told him. Kramer grunted. I said, Charles had his own photograph. Someone removed it last night. Kramer looked at the empty album page. The same picture, possibly an earlier copy. Edwin's notebook said Walter Crane had a copy, but perhaps Charles had one too. Why kill him for a photograph everyone has already seen, because his copy may not have been altered? That gave Kramer something to chew on besides the cigar. The laboratory men inspected the glass and decanter. Cyanide traces appeared in the glass, but not in the whiskey decanter or water pitcher. The poison was put directly into his drink, Kramer said. After Mrs. Ward poured it, I replied. She brought it at 9. The visitor came at 9:15. Kramer turned toward the side passage. The door to the garden had a simple lock and showed no damage. On the floor near it, a small patch of wet soil had dried into the shape of a narrow shoe. The visitor had probably entered through the front door and left through the side. Pearlie found a burned scrap of photographic paper in the fireplace. Most of it had blackened, but one corner remained intact. It showed part of a man's shoulder and the top of a carved stone railing. The picture had indeed been taken on the steps at Briar Glen. Kramer used a pair of forceps to lift it. Someone cut the picture out of the album and tried to burn it. Only after poisoning Charles, I said, or before. Either way, the picture mattered. Kramer sent officers to find Robert Lane, Samuel Holloway, Helen Mercer, and Walter Crane. Then he telephoned Wolfe from Charles's desk. I stood close enough to hear Wolfe's voice without effort. Yes? Another Holloway is dead, Kramer said. Which? Henry Holloway cyanide in his whiskey. A photograph was removed from his album. Silence. Then Wolfe asked, was anything written? Kramer looked at me. How did he know? He did not, I said. He asked. Kramer told him about the note. The photograph was wrong. April 18. Wolfe asked to speak to me. What does the album page show, he said. Nothing now. The picture was cut away. A burned fragment matches the Briar Glen steps. Size, approximately 8 by 10, larger than Margaret's copy. Therefore, more detail. That follows. Was the poison in the decanter? No, only the glass. The visitor administered it. Likely. Who knew Charles possessed the photograph? We are asking. Ask poorly and they will answer poorly. Determine why Charles wrote that the photograph was wrong. I thought the missing face was the problem. Perhaps the face was removed to prevent us from seeing that something else was wrong. What? That is your occupation. He hung up, Kramer said. He is impossible. He saves time by assuming I understand him. Do you? Occasionally. Robert Lane, Charles's secretary, arrived first. He was a thin man in his 40s with rimless spectacles and a nervous habit of smoothing his tie. He had worked for Charles for 6 years. The previous evening they had reviewed correspondence until 8. Did you see the photograph album? Kramer asked. Yes, Mr. Holloway took it from the cabinet. Why? He had received a letter asking about an old family photograph. From whom? I do not know. The letter was unsigned. What did it say? Lanes swallowed. It said, "You have kept the true picture long enough. Where is the letter?" Mr. Holloway put it in his desk. The letter was not there. Did Charles discuss Daniel Holloway? I asked. Lane looked surprised. He dictated a statement. What statement? He said Daniel had never signed away his company shares and had never voluntarily left Briar Glen. Kramer leaned toward him. Where is it? I typed it. Mr. Holloway signed it and placed it in a blue envelope. Where is the envelope? In the desk safe. The safe stood behind a painting. It was closed but unlocked. Inside were bonds, cash, property papers, and several sealed envelopes. No blue envelope. Someone had taken Charles's statement along with the photograph and the anonymous letter. Helen Mercer arrived next. She went pale when told Charles had been poisoned, but her grief did not prevent her from asking whether anything had been taken. What did you expect to be taken? I asked. Nothing. You asked before Kramer mentioned the album. She sat down. Charles telephoned me yesterday. He said he intended to tell Margaret the truth. What truth? That Daniel had been killed. Kramer stopped pacing. Did he say who killed him? He said Edwin struck Daniel during the quarrel. Samuel helped move the body. Walter Crane created the settlement to make it look as if Daniel had left. Where was the body taken? Charles did not know. He suspected the quarry. Why did he wait 25 years? Because he was afraid of Edwin. Later, he was ashamed. Did you visit Charles yesterday morning? Yes. Did you see the photograph? Helen closed her eyes briefly. Yes. Was Lydia's face removed? No, that was important enough to make everybody still. What did the complete photograph show? I asked. 6 people stood on the steps. Edwin, Clara, Samuel, Walter, Daniel, and me. Daniel? Yes. The figure whose face was cut from Margaret's photograph was Daniel. Yes. I took the restored face from my pocket and showed it to her. Is this Lydia? Yes. Then Lydia was never standing in the group photograph? No. Someone sent you her face to make you believe that she was the missing person. The whole structure shifted. The photograph Margaret had brought showed 6 bodies and 5 faces. We had assumed the missing face belonged to Lydia because the silver case supplied her photograph. But Lydia's face had been placed over Daniel's missing head. Someone had given us the wrong face deliberately. The altered photograph was not meant to erase Lydia, I said. It was meant to make us think Daniel was Lydia. Helen nodded. The original picture was taken the afternoon of April 18th, after the family claimed Daniel had left. Kramer stared at her. Then it proved he was still at Briar Glen. Yes. And Charles's larger copy showed him clearly. Yes, who knew? Edwin, Samuel, Walter Crane, Charles, and I. Clara? I think so. Who cut Daniel's face from Margaret's photograph? I do not know. Who sent Lydia's face to Wolfe? I do not know. That answer had become too common to be useless. Samuel Holloway arrived at 1:30. When he heard Charles was dead and the original picture had been stolen, he gripped the back of a chair. Who told you the picture was stolen? Kramer asked. Samuel looked trapped. No one, I assumed. You assume with the family talent. Samuel denied visiting Charles Tuesday until Kramer reminded him that Mrs. Ward had seen him. Then he admitted the visit. Charles threatened to go to the police, Samuel said. He had become confused. Confused about Daniel's death, I asked. He blamed Edwin. Did Edwin kill Daniel? Samuel looked toward Margaret. It was an accident. There it was. But Kramer did not celebrate. What happened? He demanded. Daniel confronted Edwin in the boathouse. They fought. Edwin struck him with an iron tool. Daniel fell and hit his head. Was he dead? I thought so. You helped move him. Samuel's face collapsed inward. Yes. Where? I drove with Edwin toward the quarry. I was sick. I got out near the mill road. Edwin continued alone. You never saw where the body went? No. Walter Crane forged the settlement. Edwin arranged it. Walter made the papers. Why was Daniel photographed that afternoon? Samuel shook his head. He was still alive then. The argument occurred that night. That made the photograph a clock. Daniel had been present at Briar Glen hours after the family later claimed he had departed. Kramer asked if Samuel had killed Charles. No. Did you put cyanide in his whiskey? No. Did you take the picture? No. Who did? Samuel looked toward the open library door. Walter Crane knew tops Charles kept the original. Crane could not be found. His office said he had cancelled his appointments. His housekeeper had not seen him since the previous evening. His car was gone. Kramer issued an alert. At 4, I returned to West 35th Street with Margaret. Wolfe was downstairs after his afternoon session with the orchids. Fritz brought beer for Wolfe, coffee for Margaret, and a plate of small pastries that nobody except Wolfe was prepared to appreciate properly. I reported everything. Wolfe listened with his eyes closed. When I finished, he opened them. The silver case was a diversion, he said. It contained Lydia's real face, yes, but it falsely identified the missing person. Someone knew Margaret had found an altered photograph and feared that we would identify Daniel. By sending Lydia's face, that person supplied an answer quickly enough to prevent the correct question. Who had Lydia's face? One of those who possessed another copy of the photograph or access to the photographer's records. Crane, possibly. Charles discovered the substitution. He already knew the truth. His note said the photograph was wrong because the face sent to us did not belong to the removed figure. And now he is dead. His complete copy is gone, and his signed statement has vanished. Wolfe reached for his beer. The new murder and the old disappearance are connected by proof. Daniel's presence at Briar Glen on April 18th destroyed the settlement story. Charles intended to expose that fact. Someone killed him to suppress it. Crane has disappeared. Flight is suggestive, not conclusive. Samuel confessed to helping move Daniel. Yes, but not to murder. Edwin struck Daniel. Samuel assisted afterward, and Crane fabricated the departure. Those are parts of one crime. Charles's poisoning may concern another person who has survived by preserving the same lie. Clara or Helen, or Lydia. Margaret looked up sharply. You think Lydia is alive and killing them? I think Lydia's survival has been asserted by an unknown person. That assertion may be true, false, or useful. The telephone rang, I answered. A woman spoke in a low voice. Tell Nero Wolfe that Walter Crane did not kill Charles. Who is this? The photograph shows the truth only when you look at the hands. The line went dead. I repeated it. Wolfe extended his hand for the photograph. I placed it before him. He studied the 6 figures, especially their hands. Daniel's body stood between Samuel and Walter Crane. His left hand rested on the stone railing. On one finger was a heavy ring. Charles Holloway's photograph, now stolen, had been larger and clearer. Margaret leaned closer. That ring belonged to my grandfather. Wolfe looked at her. Edwin. Yes, he wore it all his life. Then the body beneath the missing face may not be Daniel's. Margaret stared at him. But Helen said it was. Helen identified what she expected or what she wished us to believe. Wolfe pushed the photograph toward me. Archie, obtain every surviving picture of Edwin, Daniel, Charles, and Samuel, taken within 5 years of April 18th. Hands, posture, clothing, and injuries. A face may be removed. A body is less cooperative. I looked again at the figure with the missing head. The restored face had been false. Helen's identification might be false. Charles's complete photograph had been stolen before we could inspect it. Someone had poisoned him to keep us from seeing what it proved. The picture had begun as a question about one missing face. Now we could not be certain whose body stood beneath it. Chapter 5. The hidden identity. Saul Panzer found Daniel Holloway at 10:15 the next morning. He did not find him in person. Saul rarely began with the part most likely to run away. He found him in a bank ledger under the name David Hall. I was in Wolfe's office arranging photographs of the Holloway men across the long table. We had Edwin at 38, Samuel at 20, Henry Holloway at 57, and Daniel in 3 school pictures. The photographs differed in age, light, and quality, but each contained hands, shoulders, posture, and clothing, which Wolfe had declared less deceitful than faces. Wolfe was upstairs with the orchids. Fritz was in the kitchen preparing a fish dish that required more concentration than some criminal trials. I was comparing Edwin's heavy family ring with the ring visible on the faceless figure when Saul entered. He removed his hat, sat in the yellow chair, and placed a narrow notebook on my desk. "Daniel Holloway may be alive," he said. "That improves the morning. At least he was alive 6 weeks ago." I stopped looking at the photographs. Name? David Hall. Subtle. Subtle enough to survive 25 years. Saul had begun with Charles Holloway's private accounts. Most were ordinary. Household expenses, club dues, charitable gifts, taxes and investments appeared exactly where respectable money should appear. One payment did not. Every month for 24 years, Charles had transferred money to a small account at the Hudson Mutual Bank. The recipient was listed as David Hall. The first payments was $200. They later rose to $500, then $800. During the final year, Charles had paid Hall $1,500 each month. Blackmail, I asked. Maybe, but the payments did not stop when Edwin died. They doubled. Guilt often improves after a funeral. Saul nodded. There is more. Henry paid Hall's rent, medical expenses and legal fees. He also purchased a small life insurance policy, naming Margaret Holloway as beneficiary. That was not the usual arrangement between a blackmailer and his victim. Address: a furnished house in Yonkers. Hall lived there for 9 years. Before that, he used rooms in Albany, Poughkeepsie, and Newark. Charles always knew where he was. Who handled the transfers? For the first 15 years, Walter Crane. After that, Charles's secretary, Robert Lane. The office elevator hummed. Wolfe entered precisely at 11. He crossed to his chair, sat, and looked at Saul. "You have something." Daniel Holloway used the name David Hall. Wolfe's eyes moved to the notebook. Saul gave him the details. Wolfe listened without interruption, except to ring for beer. Fritz entered with a bottle and glass, poured, and withdrew as silently as a man delivering evidence. When Saul finished, Wolfe said, "Proof that Hall was Daniel. Several indications. His birth date differed by 1 day. The place of birth was listed as unknown. His account signature resembles Daniel's writing in the old family letters. Also, Henry's first payment was made 6 weeks after Daniel supposedly left for Argentina." "Not proof," Wolfe said. "No." "Then acquire it," I said. "The address is in Yonkers. You and Saul will go. Before lunch. Your concern for my meals is touching but irrelevant. Your lunch is not the one being delayed. You have eaten breakfast." That ended the discussion because Wolfe considers breakfast sufficient preparation for any hardship that does not involve him. Saul and I drove north in his car. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained low and grey. Yonkers looked washed and unwilling to discuss it. David Hall's address was a narrow brick house on a quiet street near the river. A brass plate beside the door read "Rooms," which told us the place offered shelter without promising happiness. The landlady was named Mrs. Grant. She was in her late 60s, with strong arms and suspicious eyes. "Mr. Hall is not here," she said. "When will he return?" I asked. "He will not." "Did he leave?" "Yesterday morning." That was the morning after Charles Holloway's murder became known. "Did he say where he was going?" "No." "Did he take his belongings?" "1 suitcase and a leather case. A man collected the rest last night." "What man?" "I did not know him." "Age?" "About 60. Tall. Grey coat. He kept his hat on." "Walter Crane?" She did not recognize Nesson. Saul showed her photographs of Edwin, Samuel, Charles, Daniel, and Crane. Mrs. Grant studied them slowly. She tapped Daniel's school photograph. "That could be Mr. Hall when he was young." "How certain?" Saul asked. "The eyes are the same. The nose too, Mr. Hall had a scar here." She touched the right side of her forehead. "Did he have trouble walking?" I asked. "A stiff left leg. Worse in cold weather." "Any injury to his hands?" 2 fingers on his left hand would not close properly. I looked at Saul. The faceless figure in the altered photograph rested its left hand on the railing. 2 fingers appeared unnaturally straight. "Visitors?" I asked. "Mr. Holloway came once or twice each month. Sometimes Mr. Lane brought money or papers. A woman visited several times. Describe her: white hair, thin, always wore gloves. Clara Holloway?" Mrs. Grant did not recognize Clara's photograph. "Helen Mercer?" She studied Helen's face. "Possibly. The woman was older than this picture." "Lydia Holloway?" We had no recent photograph of Lydia, only the restored young face. Mrs. Grant looked at it for a long time. "I cannot say. There is something around the eyes." "Was Mr. Hall afraid?" "Yes." "Of whom?" "He never said. He kept the curtains closed whenever a dark automobile stopped outside." "What did he do all day?" "He read newspapers, wrote letters, and repaired clocks. His room was full of them." "Did he receive mail?" "Only from a post office box." "Letters from Charles?" Came through Miss Lane. She took us upstairs. The room had been cleared in a hurry, but not professionally. The bed was stripped. Empty shelves showed clean rectangles in the dust where books had stood. A work table beneath the window held small tools, watch parts, and a brass clock with its back removed. On the wall was a pale square where a framed picture had hung. Saul examined the wastebasket. I opened drawers with Mrs. Grant's permission and found thread, envelopes, medicine bottles, and a bundle of receipts. One receipt carried the signature David Hall. The capital D began with a narrow, upward stroke. The final L bent sharply backward. It matched Daniel's writing in the old family letters closely enough to make coincidence look unemployed. Inside the clock on the work table, Saul found a folded scrap of paper. It contained 3 lines. "Edwin is dead. Charles has agreed to tell Margaret. Crane must return the true photograph." The writing matched the receipts. I read it twice. Hall knew Charles intended to confess. Saul nodded, and he knew about the photograph. The bottom drawer of the work table was locked. Mrs. Grant supplied no key, so I used one of the tools. Inside lay a photograph wrapped in cloth. It showed Lydia Holloway standing beside a man near the Hudson. Both were older than in the Briar Glen picture. Lydia appeared to be in her late 40s. The man was around 50, with a scar at his temple and a cane in one hand. On the back was written, "Daniel and Lydia, October 2013. Daniel had been alive 14 years after his supposed death. Lydia had been alive too." Mrs. Grant looked over my shoulder. "That is Mr. Hall. And the woman?" "She visited twice, years ago." "Did Hall call her Lydia?" "Yes, the story had gained 2 living ghosts. I telephoned Kramer before touching anything else. He arrived 40 minutes later with Pearlie and a local detective. By then Saul had found a bank book hidden beneath the loose bottom of a tool chest. The account belonged to David Hall. The monthly deposits from Charles appeared regularly. Most of the money had not been withdrawn. The final entry was a withdrawal of $20,000, made 3 days before Charles died. "Who made it?" Kramer asked. "The bank will have a record," Saul said. Kramer glared at the empty room. "Why leave the bank book?" "Maybe Hall did not leave voluntarily," I said. Mrs. Grant shook her head. "He walked out by himself. He looked frightened, but no one forced him." "What did he say?" "He thanked me and said a family debt was finally due." Kramer sent Pearlie to the bank and began questioning Mrs. Grant again. I called Wolfe. "Daniel is David Hall," I said. "We have a photograph dated 1999 showing him with Lydia. Charles paid his expenses for 24 years. Hall left yesterday after Charles was murdered." "Did Charles's payments purchase silence?" "Possibly, but he also paid rent, doctors, and legal bills. Hall kept most of the money. Then the payments were maintenance, not extortion. Charles may have been helping him hide, or keeping him where he could be watched." I told him about the note in the clock. "Crane must return the true photograph," Wolfe repeated. "Yes, what does that imply?" "That Crane has Charles's stolen copy. More, it implies Hall knew there were false and true versions before Margaret found the altered picture. He may be the person who sent Lydia's face." "Possibly, but the false face diverted us from Daniel. Why would Daniel conceal himself after Charles had agreed to confess? To protect Lydia? Or because the photograph exposes an identity more dangerous than his own? I looked at the picture of Daniel and Lydia. The faceless figure's stiff left fingers match Hall's injury. Good. Therefore, the body in Margaret's photograph may indeed be Daniel, but the ring belonged to Edwin. Did it? Margaret said so. Margaret knew it as her father's ring. She did not know who possessed it 25 years earlier. That was true. The family ring might originally have belonged to Daniel as the eldest son. Edwin could have taken it after Daniel disappeared. The faceless body could be Daniel's after all. Wolfe asked about Hall's recent medical care. Mrs. Grant had given Saul the name of a clinic. Hall had been treated for chronic pain, an old skull fracture, and weakness in his left leg. An old skull fracture, Wolfe said. Consistent with Samuel's account of the boathouse struggle, Daniel survived the blow. Yes. The question is who saved him? Charles? Likely. I considered the midnight car trip. Edwin and Samuel believed Daniel was dead. Edwin drove toward the quarry alone after Samuel left the car. Perhaps Daniel recovered. Or Charles followed and intervened. Then Charles helped Daniel disappear, which explains the payments and secrecy. It does not absolve him. Before Wolfe ended the call, he instructed us to find Robert Lane. Lane was no longer at Ashcroft House. Kramer's men found his apartment empty and his desk drawers cleared. His bank account showed a deposit of $10,000 made the day after Charles died. The deposit came from Walter Crane's law office. Kramer's face improved when he heard that. A direct line between two missing men had entered the case. Pearlie returned from the bank at 4. David Hall had withdrawn the $20,000 in person. The bank camera showed an elderly man with a cane, a scar at his temple, and 2 stiff fingers on his left hand. He had not come alone. A second man waited near the entrance. The photograph from the camera was poor, but the second man was tall, wore a gray coat, and carried a leather briefcase. Mrs. Grant identified him as the man who had collected Hall's belongings. I looked at the picture. So that is, probably Crane. Kramer grunted. Probably is for weather reports. The bank manager supplied one more detail. Hall had requested the money in $100 bills and asked whether a sealed envelope had arrived for him. It had. The envelope bore Charles Holloway's return address and had been mailed the morning before Charles died. Hall opened it inside the bank. The manager saw a photograph and several folded pages. Hall became visibly upset. Did he leave them? Kramer asked. No. What did the photograph show? The manager saw only the back. Charles had written one sentence on it. What sentence? Pearlie consulted his notes. The person removed was not the victim. That sentence traveled with us back to West 35th Street. Wolfe was in the office after his afternoon session with the Orchids. He had already received Saul's report by telephone. On the long table were the copies of the family photographs, the account book, the forged settlement, and the altered picture. Kramer arrived 10 minutes later because he had decided Wolfe knew too much to be left comfortable. Wolfe listened while Pearlie repeated the bank manager's account. The person removed was not the victim, Wolfe said. Kramer remained standing. What does it mean? That the missing face belonged to someone involved in Daniel's disappearance, but not harmed by it. Edwin? Possibly. I placed the photograph of Daniel and Lydia beside the altered family picture. The body's injured left fingers matched Daniel. If the ring was originally his, the faceless figure could still be Daniel. Wolfe shook his head. No. The injuries occurred on the night he disappeared. The family photograph was taken that afternoon. His fingers would not yet have been damaged. That stopped me. The figure in the family photograph had held 2 fingers stiffly before Daniel suffered the skull injury. Either the stiffness came from an earlier injury, or the body was not Daniel's. Wolfe selected a photograph of Henry Holloway taken 26 years earlier. Charles's left hand showed 2 straight fingers. An old caption on the back mentioned a childhood accident with machinery. The faceless body was Charles, I said. Likely, but Helen said it was Daniel. Helen lied. Why remove Charles's face? To conceal his presence at Briar Glen on April 18th. Kramer frowned. Charles lived 3 miles away. His presence was no secret, not ordinarily. But the note mailed to Hall said the person removed was not the victim. Charles was not Daniel, the victim of the old crime. His removal concealed his role as witness or accomplice. I looked at the list from Edwin's notebook. W.C.'s has the copy. M.H. must never know. Ask about the silver case. The photograph did not prove Daniel was still there, I said. It proved Charles was present. And his presence mattered because the family later claimed he knew nothing of the confrontation. Wolfe said. Kramer paced once across the office. Then why? Send Lydia's face. To make Margaret and us identify the missing figure as a dead woman. It diverted attention from Charles. Who sent it? Someone who feared Charles' connection to Daniel would be discovered. Crane? Perhaps. Kramer made a noise expressing his opinion of perhaps. Saul pointed to the payment ledger. Charles knew Daniel was alive almost from the beginning. He created David Hall, paid his expenses, and used Crane to move the money. Wolfe nodded. Charles found Daniel after Edwin attempted to dispose of him. He obtained medical help under a false name. He then persuaded Daniel to remain hidden. Why would Daniel agree? I asked. Because Lydia was threatened. Because Edwin controlled the company, the police story, and the family money. Because Daniel was injured and vulnerable. Or because Charles promised eventual restitution. The payments kept him silent. They also kept him alive. Kramer said, that makes Charles part of the old cover-up. Yes, but after Edwin's death, Charles prepared to confess. He contacted Daniel, wrote a statement, and intended to show Margaret the true photograph. Therefore, he was poisoned. By Crane? Crane arranged the false settlement and altered legal records. Exposure would destroy him. Then why is Hall missing? Because Crane required the papers Charles mailed to him. The office grew quiet, Kramer said. You think Crane took Hall? I think Hall withdrew money and left voluntarily after receiving Charles's envelope. Crane then joined or intercepted him. Whether Hall remains free is uncertain. The doorbell rang. I went to the hall. No one was on the stoop. A flat envelope lay against the door. It was addressed to Margaret Holloway, care of Nero Wolfe. I carried it into the office and opened it under Kramer's supervision. Inside was a recent photograph. Daniel Holloway stood beside a railway platform clock, holding that day's newspaper. He was alive, elderly, scarred, and leaning on a cane. Beside him stood Walter Crane. On the back, in Daniel's handwriting, were 2 sentences. Charles paid for my silence, but not for the reason you think. Find Lydia before Crane does. Wolfe read it once and placed it on his desk. Daniel Holloway is alive, Kramer said. Yes, and Crane is with him. Yes. Where? Wolfe looked at the railway clock in the photograph. That, he said, is what Mr. Goodwin will determine. Daniel had been struck, carried away, erased from his inheritance, and hidden under another name for 25 years. Charles had paid to keep him silent, but the final message made one fact clear. The money had not purchased Daniel's silence alone. It had protected Lydia's hiding place. Chapter 6. The face that was removed a photograph may lie, but it requires assistance. At 9:30 the next morning, I carried the altered Holloway picture into the laboratory of Simon Kells, a photographic expert on East 41st Street. Inspector Kramer had recommended him with the warning that Kells charged as though light itself sent him invoices. Kells was a narrow man with silver hair, thick glasses, and fingers stained by chemicals. His laboratory contained enlargers, lenses, trays, and cameras, old enough to remember when people sat still for portraits because movement cost money. Kramer stood beside me. Pearlie Stebbins occupied a stool near the door. Margaret Holloway watched from the far side of the work table. Kells placed the photograph beneath a magnifying instrument. You say the face was removed years ago, he asked. We say someone wanted it to look that way, I replied. He grunted, approvingly. The picture showed 6 figures on the steps at Briar Glen. Edwin Holloway stood beside Clara. Samuel, Helen Mercer, and Walter Crane occupied the remaining visible positions. Between Samuel and Crane stood the faceless figure, one hand on the stone railing. The missing oval had been cut cleanly from the print. A strip showing Lydia Holloway's face had later been sent to Wolfe in the silver cigarette case, encouraging us to place her head over the empty body. That identification had already begun to collapse. Kells examined the cut under 3 types of light. Then he photographed the photograph, enlarged the opening, and studied the exposed edges of the paper. The face was removed from the front, he said. The blade was extremely sharp. Whoever did it followed the jaw and hairline instead of cutting a simple circle. Meaning, Kramer asked. The person wished to remove one identity while preserving the body. That much we knew. Kells looked at Kramer over his glasses. Then you have saved my morning. Kramer did not answer. Kells turned the photograph over. The rear mounting card contained no writing, but under angled light he detected faint pressure marks. Someone wrote on a sheet while this photograph lay beneath it. He made a rubbing on thin paper. Several broken letters emerged. Dan, EDW. April 18. Margaret leaned closer. Daniel and Edward. Kramer frowned. Who is Edward? Margaret shook her head. I do not know. Kells returned to the front. Around the cut edge remained tiny fragments of hair, one corner of an ear, and a narrow shadow along the collar. These fragments may be enough, he said. Do you have confirmed photographs of Daniel Holloway? I gave him the childhood pictures and the later photograph found in David Hall's room. Kells spent an hour measuring the distance between Daniel's eyes, the angle of his ear, the shape of his hairline, and the line from cheek to jaw. He compared those measurements with what remained around the empty space. At 11:20, he removed his glasses. The missing face belonged to Daniel Holloway. Margaret sat very still. Kramer said, certain as one can be without the removed portion. The surviving ear, hairline, and jaw shadow correspond to Daniel Holloway. The Lydia fragment could never have belonged in this opening. Her head was smaller, and the light struck her from the opposite side. So whoever sent Lydia's face knew it was false, I said. Yes, even a careless observer would notice the lighting if the pieces were joined. The deception had not been intended to survive expert inspection. It had been intended to give us a quick answer before we asked a better question. Kells was not finished. The body presents another problem. He enlarged the figure's hands and shoulders. The left hand rested on the railing. 2 fingers appeared stiff. The right shoulder sat lower than the left. A heavy ring was visible on one finger. We assumed those details belonged to Daniel, I said. They may not. But you just said the face was Daniel's. The head was Daniel's. I did not say the body was. Kramer leaned over the table. You think the picture was altered before the face was cut out? I think it may be a composite. That earned him everyone's full attention. Kells explained that early photographic retouching could combine parts from separate negatives. A skilled printer could place one head on another body, soften the joining line, and re-photograph the result. The technique was often used to add absent relatives to formal groups or improve damaged portraits. He pointed to the collar. The grain around the neck differs slightly from the grain in the face. The head was inserted before the final print was made. Margaret stared at the picture. Then Daniel may never have stood in that exact position. His face was placed there, Kells said. The body belonged to someone else. Who? Kells folded his hands. For that, you need family photographs. We returned to West 35th Street shortly before noon. Wolfe had just descended from the plant rooms and was settling behind his desk. Saul Panzer sat in the yellow chair with a folder on his knee. I reported Kells's findings. Wolfe listened without visible surprise. The missing head was Daniel's, I concluded, but it had already been attached to another man's body before the picture was printed. Wolfe rang for beer. Mr. Kells is competent. Kramer says yes, though he resents the fee. Inspector Kramer resents any expense not involving cigars. Fritz entered, poured Wolfe's beer, and withdrew. Wolfe looked at Saul. Edward Holloway? Saul opened the folder. There was an Edward Holloway. He was Henry Holloway's only son. Margaret turned toward him. Uncle Charles had a son. Yes. Edward was born 6 months after Daniel. The two boys were raised together at Briar Glen until Edward was 12. What happened to him? The official family record says he died in a boating accident at 17. Death certificate? I asked. Nen. That was becoming a Holloway tradition. Saul placed 3 photographs on Wolfe's desk. The first showed Daniel and Edward at about 10 years old. They were not identical, but they were close enough to confuse anyone seeing them at a distance. Both had dark hair, long faces, and the same Holloway eyes. The second showed Edward at 16. A machine accident had injured his left hand, leaving 2 fingers rigid. His right shoulder had also been damaged. The third was taken a year later. Edward wore the heavy family ring. Margaret touched the picture. My father wore that ring. After Edward disappeared, Saul said. Wolfe studied the 3 photographs. The body in the altered picture was Edward's, he said. Daniel's head was placed upon it. Why? Margaret asked. To make one man appear to be another? Saul continued his report. Edward's supposed boating accident occurred 18 years before Daniel's disappearance. No body had been recovered. Henry claimed his son fell from a boat during a storm, yet harbor records showed no storm that week, and the family boat had not left its berth. Then Edward did not die at 17, I said. No. He appeared in 2 later company records under the name Edward Dale. He worked briefly in Holloway Precision Instruments' testing division. When? Until the year Daniel disappeared. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Therefore, 2 men with nearly identical faces were alive, under altered names within the same family enterprise. Margaret looked from Daniel's photograph to Edward's. Why erase Edward too? Saul supplied the likely reason. Charles, Sr., father of Daniel, Edwin, and Samuel, had created an early ownership agreement dividing company shares among Daniel and Edward. Daniel received 30% as the eldest son. Edward received 15% because Charles Jr. had invested in the company's first factory. A later will removed both names. Walter Crane had prepared the later document. The inheritance fraud concerned 2 claimants, I said. Not one. Yes, Wolfe replied. Daniel had the larger claim, but Edward could confirm it. Margaret looked at the altered photograph. Why put Daniel's face on Edward's body? Wolfe leaned back. To create proof that Daniel was present when only Edward had been photographed, or to conceal that Edward was present when the family claimed him dead. Kramer had followed us from Kells's laboratory and now stood near the bookshelves. Which? Wolfe drank beer before answering. The photograph was taken on April 18th, the day Daniel supposedly left Briar Glen. If Daniel's head was inserted onto Edward's body, someone wanted the picture to establish Daniel's presence without revealing Edward's survival. Why establish Daniel's presence? Kramer asked. As protection. If Daniel later accused Edwin of fraud, Edwin could produce a picture showing Daniel at the estate after the settlement and claim he had remained willingly. That does not sound dangerous enough for 2 murders. The danger lies not in the picture itself, but in the identity exchange it concealed. Wolfe selected the childhood photograph of Daniel and Edward. Consider the night of April 18th. Daniel was to confront Edwin over the stolen inheritance. Edward, long declared dead, was secretly at Briar Glen and resembled him closely. Samuel saw an argument near the boathouse. Helen saw a man with Edwin and Samuel, but could not identify his face. You think they mistook Edward for Daniel, I said. I think someone did. Margaret's face had gone pale. Who was struck? That remains uncertain. Daniel survived with a skull injury, I said. Mrs. Grant said his left leg was weak and his forehead scarred. Therefore, Daniel was injured that night. But he may not have been the only man present, Kramer said. And Edward? No verified record exists after April 18th. That placed another possible victim at the center of the old crime. The telephone rang, I answered. It was Robert Lane, Charles's missing secretary. His voice trembled. I need to speak to Mr. Wolfe. Where are you? That does not matter. It matters to the police. I did not kill Mr. Holloway. Then come explain that. Walter Crane paid me to remove the blue envelope from the safe. He said it contained private family papers. I did not know Charles had been poisoned. Where is the envelope? Crane took it. What was inside? I opened it first. That was the wisest thing Lane had done. There was a signed statement and a photograph, he continued. Charles wrote that Edwin had killed the wrong man. I gripped the receiver.
Exact words.
He wrote, Edwin believed the man at the quarry was Daniel. It was Edward. Wolfe's eyes fixed on me. I asked, what happened to Daniel? The statement, said Charles, found Daniel injured near the boathouse and hid him before Edwin returned. Daniel had been struck earlier, but recovered. And Edward? Edward arrived later wearing Daniel's coat. Edwin saw him in the dark and believed Daniel had returned to threaten him. He struck Edward and took him to the quarry. The mistaken identity was no longer theory. Why was Edward wearing Daniel's coat? Charles did not know. Where are you? Lane began to answer, then the line crackled. A second voice spoke in the background. Lane gasped. The receiver struck something hard. The connection ended. I gave Kramer the number from the exchange. He and Pearlie left at once to trace it. Wolfe remained motionless. Margaret looked at him. My father killed Edward, thinking he was Daniel. According to Charles's statement, and Uncle Charles hid Daniel for 25 years. Yes. Why? To protect Daniel from Edwin, and to protect himself from prosecution. He had helped create the false identity, the payments, and the silence. Saul pointed to the altered photograph. Who made the composite? Walter Crane, Wolfe said, or a photographer acting under his direction. Crane needed a picture that concealed Edward's survival while preserving a record of Daniel's supposed presence. I said, then later someone cut Daniel's face out. Edwin. Why destroy the identification he had paid to create? Because after Edward's death, the composite became dangerous. Anyone learning the body belonged to Edward could prove that Edward had survived his reported boating accident and was present at Briar Glen on the night Edwin killed him. So Edwin removed Daniel's face but kept the picture. Guilt, leverage, or fear. He also kept Lydia's silver case because Lydia knew the exchange had occurred. Margaret stared at the empty oval. The face was removed to hide Daniel. No, Wolfe said. Daniel was already hidden under the name David Hall. The face was removed to prevent anyone from asking why Daniel's head had been placed on Edward's body. The office fell silent. The old photograph did not show a simple family gathering. It was a constructed alibi. Daniel's face, Edward's injured hand, Edwin's stolen ring, and a date selected to support a false departure had been combined into one polished lie. That lie had survived 25 years because everyone who understood it had either vanished, kept silent, or died. Now Robert Lane had repeated Charles's final statement over the telephone. Edwin Holloway had not killed Daniel at the quarry. He had killed Edward Holloway by mistake. And somewhere in New York, Walter Crane possessed the photograph and statement that proved it. Chapter 7. The Family Secret. The trouble with a family lie is that each generation adds furniture. By the time the Holloways had finished with Daniel, Edward, Lydia, the quarry, the false settlement, and the altered photograph, the original truth was buried beneath enough decoration to furnish a hotel. At 9 the next morning, Inspector Kramer telephoned to report that Robert Lane had been found alive in a roadside motel near White Plains. He had a bruised jaw, a cut above one eye, and an improved respect for answering questions honestly. Kramer brought him to the brownstone at 11:30. Lane sat in the red leather chair with one side of his face swollen. Kramer stood behind him. Pearlie Stebbins remained near the door. Saul Panzer occupied the yellow chair, and I sat at my desk with the old photograph within reach. Wolfe entered from the plant rooms, settled behind his desk, and looked at Lane. "You telephoned this office yesterday," Wolfe said. "Yes. You stated that Charles Holloway had written a confession saying Edwin killed Edward while believing him to be Daniel." Lane lowered his eyes. "That was not true," Kramer growled. "Tell him all of it." Lane swallowed. The words were written on a sheet placed beside the telephone. "A man stood behind me with a pistol." "Who?" Wolfe asked. "I knew him as Everett Dale." Saul's head lifted. "Describe him," Wolfe said. "About 60, tall, thin grey hair. His left hand had 2 stiff fingers. He walked with one shoulder lower than the other. The body in the altered photograph had possessed those same features." "Was he Edward Holloway?" I asked. Lane looked at me. "I did not know until Mr. Holloway told me 2 weeks ago." Margaret Holloway, seated beside the bookshelves, made a small sound. Wolfe said, "Proceed." Lane had worked for Charles for 6 years. During that time, Everett Dale visited Ashcroft House, perhaps once every 2 months. He was introduced as an investment advisor. The meetings were private, and Lane was instructed never to record Dale's name in the appointment book. "What did they discuss?" Wolfe asked. "I do not know. After Edwin died, the arguments became louder. Mr. Holloway wanted to make a public statement. Dale told him silence had protected the family for 25 years. Did Walter Crane attend those meetings?" "Sometimes." "Where is Mr. Crane?" Lane shook his head. "Dale took him away from the motel last night." Kramer stepped forward. "You left that out. You did not ask." Kramer's face suggested he might correct Lane's bruised jaw from the other side. Wolfe lifted a finger. "Why was Mr. Crane there?" "Dale brought him." Mr. Crane looked frightened. "He told me to read the statement over the telephone, exactly as written. After I finished, Dale cut the line and took him away." "What was the purpose of the false story?" "To make you believe Edward died 25 years ago." "Why?" "Because Edward Holloway is Everett Dale." Silence occupied the office. The facts had pointed there, but facts are often more impressive after someone says them aloud. Wolfe turned to Saul. "You have confirmed it?" Saul opened a folder. "Everett Dale first appeared in business records 24 years ago. No birth certificate, school record, military record, or earlier employment exists under that name. His signature matches Edward Holloway's surviving school papers. He controls 3 investment companies and a machinery supplier called Dale Industrial Systems." Margaret stared at him. "I have heard of that company." "You should have," Saul said. "It sold equipment to Holloway Precision Instruments for 19 years. How much business?" "More than $12 million. Kramer moved toward Saul. "Fraud? Nearly half the equipment was overpriced. Some was never delivered. Payments passed through Dale companies and returned to private accounts." "Whose accounts?" "Edward Holloway's, with portions transferred to Walter Crane and several company officers." Wolfe's eyes closed for a moment. "There is the old crime," he said. Margaret looked at him. "Not Daniel's murder?" "Daniel was not murdered. He was purchased." Her face tightened. Wolfe placed his palms on the arms of his chair. 25 years ago, Daniel Holloway discovered that Edward was stealing from the family company. Edward had been declared dead after a fictitious boating accident, but he continued working secretly under the name Edward Dale. The false death removed him from family records, while allowing him to conduct transactions that could not easily be connected to Charles. "Why would Charles help his own son steal?" I asked. "At first, he may not have known. Later, he protected him. Blood frequently defeats judgment." Saul placed several accounting sheets on Wolfe's desk. Daniel had discovered false invoices, invented suppliers, and payments authorized through Walter Crane. He also learned that Edward had signed documents using Daniel's name. Kramer frowned. "Why Daniel's name?" "Because Daniel owned 30% of the company," Wolfe said. "His signature was necessary for certain transfers. Edward resembled him closely enough to deceive clerks and witnesses who knew Daniel only casually." I picked up the altered photograph. The mistaken identity. Yes, Edward attended at least one company meeting wearing Daniel's coat and ring. Those present assumed he was Daniel. The group photograph was later constructed to support that assumption. Daniel's head was placed on Edward's body. Margaret looked at the empty oval. So the photograph was an alibi. More accurately, a manufactured witness. It established that Daniel had been present and participating in company affairs on April 18th. The day he supposedly accepted the settlement, I said. Wolfe nodded. Daniel intended to expose the false invoices and forged authorizations. Edward and Mr. Crane needed him silent. Edwin feared that a public scandal would destroy the company and reveal that he had also benefited from altered inheritance papers. So they paid Daniel $50,000. No, they promised $50,000. The bank records show Edwin returned most of the cash. Then what did Daniel receive? A new identity, regular payments, and protection for Lydia. Margaret leaned forward. Protection from whom? Edward. Wolfe turned to Lane. Did Charles ever speak of Lydia? Yes. He said she had helped Daniel collect proof. Edward threatened to accuse her of stealing company documents and participating in the fraud. Daniel agreed to disappear if Lydia was left unharmed. The arrangement had been constructed by Walter Crane. Daniel became David Hall. Lydia left Briar Glen soon afterward and lived under several names. Charles sent money to Daniel every month, partly as restitution and partly to preserve silence. The buried wallet, watch, settlement, and belt buckle were planted to support the story that Daniel had accepted payment and fled. The quarry evidence had not marked a murder. It had marked the burial of an identity. What about Daniel's injuries? I asked. Older than his disappearance, Saul replied. The clinic records were incomplete. I found an earlier hospital entry under his real name. He fractured his skull and injured his leg in a factory accident 3 years before he vanished. Another piece of the false quarry story fell away. Kramer looked at Lane. Charles knew all this. Yes. He helped arrange the payments. He said it was the worst thing he had ever done. Why confess now? Edwin was dead. Charles believed Edward no longer controlled the company. Daniel had written saying he would return and tell Margaret everything. Margaret's eyes moved toward the recent railway photograph. Daniel returned to New York 3 weeks ago, Saul said. He met Charles twice. Wolfe said Charles agreed to support his claim, restore his ownership, and expose Edward's fraud. He prepared a signed statement and kept the true photograph as evidence. The photograph that was stolen after his murder, I said. Yes, Kramer's cigar shifted. Edward killed Charles. Wolfe regarded him. The conclusion is sound. The proof requires arrangement. Lane supplied the arrangement. On the night Charles died, Everett Dale arrived at Ashcroft House shortly after 9. Lane had already left, but Charles told him the next morning's appointment was cancelled because he expected a private visitor. Mrs. Ward heard the bell at 9:15. 20 minutes later, she heard the side door close. Charles's whiskey contained cyanide, placed directly in the glass. The decanter and water pitcher remained clean. Edward came to stop the confession, Kramer said. He came to retrieve the photograph, Daniel's letter, and Charles's statement, Wolfe replied. When Charles refused, Edward poisoned the drink. Margaret's face had become white. Why would Charles drink after arguing with him? The poison was likely introduced while Charles answered the telephone or searched the safe. Edward knew his habits and the room. The anonymous call Charles received before the visitor arrived, I asked. Edward confirming that Charles was alone. Wolfe looked at Lane again. Where did Edward obtain the cyanide? Lane hesitated. Dale Industrial Systems uses it in metal testing, Mr. Holloway complained that Edward kept dangerous chemicals in a private workshop. Kramer wrote something in his notebook. The same company that had served the fraud had supplied the murder weapon. What happened after Charles's death? Wolfe asked. Edward called me, Lane said. He said Mr. Crane wanted the blue envelope removed before the police sealed the house. He offered me $10,000. You took it? Yes. You opened it? Lane looked ashamed. Yes. What did the real statement say? that Daniel discovered Edward's theft and had been forced to disappear. Charles admitted arranging the payments. He said, Walter Crane created the false legal records, and Edwin approved them. Nothing about Edward being killed at the quarry? No. What photograph was enclosed? The complete group picture. Who stood in the disputed position? Edward's body with Daniel's face. How could Charles prove that? He included the original unaltered picture showing Edward's real face. That was the photograph Edward had feared. The composite showed Daniel's head on Edward's body. The unaltered print showed Edward standing there. Together, they proved that the family had manufactured evidence of Daniel's presence and concealed Edward's survival. "Where are the documents now?" Kramer asked. Edward took them. "And Daniel? I do not know." Wolfe's eyes moved to the railway photograph. The message on its back had read, "Charles paid for my silence, but not for the reason you think. Find Lydia before Crane does." "Daniel knew Charles was dead when that photograph was delivered," I said. "Yes," Wolfe replied. "He also knew Edward would seek Lydia, because she possesses independent proof of the original fraud." Margaret said, "Where is she?" Saul answered. "I found a woman named Laura Hayes who matches Lydia's age and history. She has lived for 12 years in a small house near Cold Spring. Charles paid the property taxes through an intermediary." Kramer turned toward him. "Why did you not lead with that?" "Because 2 men are already watching the house. Edward's men, possibly. One is Walter Crane." Kramer headed for the door. Pearlie followed. Wolfe said, "Inspector." Kramer stopped. "Do not enter openly. A woman may be in danger." "Precisely. If Edward is watching, an obvious police arrival may provoke him." Kramer stared at him for 2 seconds. "What do you suggest, Mr.?" "Panzer has arranged for local officers to close the roads discreetly. Mr. Goodwin will approach from the rear with Saul. You will remain near enough to be useful." "That is my case. It is also my client's aunt." Margaret looked surprised at the word client, as though she had forgotten that Wolfe's interest and professional obligation occasionally occupied the same room. An hour later, Saul and I were in his car heading north. Kramer followed at a distance with Pearlie. Rain began again, light but steady. The address lay on a wooded road above the river. We left the car half a mile away and approached through wet trees. Lydia's house was small, white, and isolated. A dark sedan stood near the road. Another car was partly hidden behind a shed. Through the rear window, I saw an elderly woman seated at a kitchen table. She had Lydia Holloway's eyes. A man stood behind her. He was tall and gray-haired. One shoulder sat lower than the other. His left hand rested on the table, 2 fingers held stiff. Everett Dale, Edward Holloway. Walter Crane sat in a chair near the wall, his hands bound. Saul touched my arm and pointed toward the front path. Daniel Holloway was approaching the house with a cane in one hand and a leather folder in the other. He did not know Edward was waiting inside. I moved before Saul could object. Daniel reached the porch. The front door opened. Edward raised a pistol. "Daniel," he said, "you have spent 25 years returning at the wrong time." Daniel stood motionless. Behind Edward, Lydia rose from the kitchen table. "You killed Charles," she said. Edward's face tightened. "He chose you and Daniel over his own son." "No," Lydia replied. "He chose the truth too late. I stepped from the side of the house with my gun drawn." "Drop it, Edward." He turned. Saul appeared at the rear door. Kramer and Pearlie came up the front path with 2 local officers. For a moment, Edward measured the distances. Then he lowered the pistol. Kramer took it from him and snapped on the handcuffs. Walter Crane sagged in his chair with relief. Daniel looked at Lydia. They had spent 25 years alive, separated, and officially dead. Wolfe had reconstructed the family secret before we reached the house. Daniel Holloway had not been murdered. He had discovered a thief who wore his face well enough to steal his name. Edward had survived behind the false identity created to conceal his fraud. Henry had paid Daniel to disappear, then paid for the rest of his life because silence had become easier than justice. When Henry finally chose to speak, Edward had poisoned him. The old photograph had hidden the substitution for a quarter of a century. Now both men whose identities it had confused stood on the same porch. One had returned to recover his name. The other was being taken away in handcuffs. Chapter 8. Wolfe's final explanation. By 9 o'clock the following evening, Wolfe's office contained 2 people who had been declared dead, several relatives who had helped preserve the deception, 1 murderer, 2 police officers, and me. Daniel and Lydia were the 2 people falsely declared dead. Edward was falsely reported dead too, but he is already counted separately as the murderer. So saying, 3 people counts him twice. The arithmetic was unusual, even for West 35th Street. Daniel Holloway sat in the red leather chair, leaning slightly on his cane. 25 years under the name David Hall had made him thinner and quieter than the boy in the old photographs. But the Holloway eyes remained. Lydia sat beside him. Time had silvered her hair and sharpened her face, yet the resemblance to the strip of photograph sent in the cigarette case was unmistakable. Margaret occupied the chair near my desk. She had spent the day learning that her father, her great-uncle, and half the family history had been built out of edited facts. She looked tired but steady. Clara Holloway sat near the bookshelves. Samuel Holloway stood behind her, unwilling to sit and unable to leave. Helen Mercer had chosen a chair near the wall. Walter Crane sat beside the Globe under Pearlie Stebbins's supervision. His wrists were free, but Pearlie's position made the privilege academic. Edward Holloway, known for 25 years as Everett Dale, stood between 2 plainclothes officers. Inspector Kramer stood at the corner of Wolfe's desk. He had agreed to bring Edward to the gathering because Wolfe claimed he could obtain a complete confession. Kramer had described that claim as vanity and arrived 10 minutes early. Wolfe entered at 9 precisely. He crossed to his custom-made chair, lowered himself into it, and surveyed the room. Fritz followed with beer, placed the bottle and glass on the desk, and withdrew after giving Edward a look usually reserved for spoiled food. Wolfe poured. "No speeches," Edward said. His voice was calm, but he had not looked at Daniel since entering the room. Wolfe raised the glass and examined the foam. "You have mistaken your position, sir. You may interrupt when invited." Kramer said, "Get on with it." Wolfe put down the glass. "Mr. Goodwin, the photograph." I removed it from its envelope and placed it on the long table. The picture showed 6 people standing on the steps at Briar Glen. 5 faces remained. The 6th had been carefully cut away. The body beneath the empty oval wore a light coat, a heavy ring, and the physical injuries once associated with Edward Holloway. Beside the damaged photograph, I placed 2 additional images. One showed Daniel and Edward as boys. The other was the unaltered group photograph recovered from Lydia's house after Edward's arrest. In that picture, Edward's own face remained attached to his body. Wolfe leaned back. This affair began when Miss Margaret Holloway found an altered photograph among her father's private papers. She wished to identify the missing person. Her relatives supplied several answers, all false. The missing person was called a servant, a distant cousin, an assistant, and an unimportant visitor. Samuel shifted. Wolfe looked at him. "You knew the truth, Mr. Holloway." Samuel's mouth tightened. "Some of it. You knew enough to lie," Clara said quietly. "Yes," Wolfe replied, "but not all for the same reason." He indicated the unaltered photograph. The body, in the disputed position, belonged to Edward Holloway, the only son of Henry Holloway. Edward had supposedly died in a boating accident years before the photograph was taken. No body was recovered, no death certificate was issued, and the family boat never left its berth. Edward said nothing. Edward's death was invented, Wolfe continued. It removed him from the family record while permitting him to work secretly within Holloway Precision Instruments. Under the name Edward Dale and later Everett Dale, he created suppliers, testing firms, and investment companies through which he diverted money. Kramer glanced at Saul Panzer, who sat in the yellow chair with the financial records on his lap. Saul opened the folder. "More than $12 million passed through companies controlled by Edward," he said. At least 4 million was diverted through false invoices and non-existent equipment. Edward looked at him. Those figures are interpretations. They are arithmetic, Wolfe said. Arithmetic has little interest in your interpretation. Daniel rested both hands on his cane. I found the invoices, he said. Wolfe nodded. Daniel Holloway owned 30% of the company under the original family agreement. Certain transfers required his approval. Edward resembled him closely enough to impersonate him before clerks and minor officials who knew Daniel only from descriptions or old photographs. Margaret looked at the two boyhood pictures. They were nearly the same age, born 6 months apart, Wolfe said. Cousins raised in the same household, similar in face, height, and voice. The resemblance became a weapon. Wolfe pointed toward the altered photograph. The image was manufactured after Edward attended a company gathering while dressed as Daniel. A photographer combined Daniel's face with Edward's body. The resulting print established that Daniel had been present and had apparently approved certain business arrangements. Walter Crane shifted in his chair. Hi. Wolfe turned to him. You arranged the alteration. Crane's lips moved before sound emerged. I followed instructions. From Edward? From Edwin Holloway. Edward looked at him sharply. Crane corrected himself. From both, Kramer said. That is better. Keep going. Crane lowered his eyes. Wolfe continued. Daniel discovered the fraud. Lydia assisted him in collecting invoices, account books, and signed authorizations. He intended to expose Edward and challenge the altered inheritance documents that reduced his ownership. Daniel looked toward Lydia. She found the original agreement, he said. Without her, I would have had only suspicions. Lydia's voice remained calm. Walter Crane had replaced it with an earlier will. Crane said, Edwin ordered it. Edwin profited, Wolfe replied. You prepared it. Edward used it. Crane did not answer. Wolfe lifted the forged settlement found beneath the boathouse. To stop Daniel, Edwin, Edward, Charles, and Mr. Crane created a false departure. This document claimed Daniel accepted $50,000 and surrendered his company shares. The money was never paid. Most of it returned to Edwin's account the following morning. Kramer looked at Daniel. Why agree to disappear? Daniel's hands tightened around the cane. Edward threatened Lydia. He had forged her name on several company papers. He said she would go to prison with him. Edwin said the company would collapse. Hundreds would lose their jobs, and no one would believe me over the entire family. You could have gone to the police, Kramer said. I tried. Walter told them I was unstable and angry over an inheritance. Then I was attacked near the factory. Wolfe said, the injuries later attributed to a struggle at the boathouse had occurred earlier. Daniel was vulnerable, isolated, and afraid for Lydia. Charles offered him another identity and regular support if he vanished. Charles's part had not been clean, but it had been complicated. He created David Hall, arranged rooms, paid Daniel's expenses, and kept his location secret from Edwin and Edward. He also persuaded Daniel that continued silence protected Lydia. The buried wallet, watch, belt buckle, and settlement were planted, Wolfe. They were insurance. If Daniel's disappearance was questioned, the objects supported the story that he had surrendered his name and left voluntarily. Margaret looked at Samuel. And the quarry? Samuel stared at the floor. Edwin put the bumper there. He wanted people to think an accident or violence had happened if the settlement story failed. The family created 2 explanations, Wolfe said, one in which Daniel departed willingly, and another in which he may have died without implicating Edward's fraud. Confusion was itself protection. Kramer removed the cigar from his mouth. What about the photograph found in Edwin's drawer? Wolfe turned toward it. Years after the original composite was created, Edwin cut away Daniel's face. He had begun to fear the image. If examined by an expert, it could reveal that Daniel's head had been placed on Edward's body. That discovery would prove Edward had survived his reported death and participated in the fraud. Margaret said, why keep it at all? because Edwin feared Edward as much as he protected him. The photograph was evidence against Edward. Edwin removed the identifying face, but preserved the body and the photographic manipulation. A private weapon, I said. Yes. The Holloways stored threats as other families store heirlooms. Edward gave a short laugh. My cousin Edwin was not frightened of me. Wolfe looked at him. He kept the picture in a locked drawer for 24 years. He wrote that some faces were removed too late. He prepared to alter the trust and release the file marked DH. Fear may be expressed without trembling. Edward's expression hardened. Wolfe turned to Lydia. You sent the silver cigarette case to this house? Yes. Margaret stared at her. Why did you send your own face? To warn Daniel that the photograph had been found. That warning misled us, I said. Lydia nodded. I did not know Daniel's face had been cut away. I believed the missing portion was mine. Edwin had taken several photographs from me years ago. The silver case contained the only loose portrait I still possessed. That resolved a point that had appeared more calculated than it was. The message said you were alive when Edwin died, Margaret said. I wrote it. Edwin contacted me a week before his death. He said he wanted to confess, but he died before we met. Wolfe said, the delivery was not designed to identify the missing figure falsely. It was Lydia's attempt to announce her survival without revealing her address. The mistaken identification was ours, encouraged by the family's conflicting lies. Helen lowered her head. I said the missing figure was Daniel because Charles told me it was. No, Wolfe said. You said it because you feared that naming Edward would expose your knowledge of his survival. Your lie delayed us but did not cause Charles's death. Helen accepted that without protest. Wolfe poured more beer. After Edwin died, Daniel returned to New York. He contacted Charles and demanded restoration of his name, his company interest, and the truth. Charles had paid him for years, but payment had ceased to satisfy either guilt or justice. Daniel said, I did not want more money. You wanted acknowledgement, Wolfe replied, and Lydia safe. Charles agreed to provide both. He prepared a signed statement describing Edward's fraud, the false identity, the forged settlement, and the altered photograph. He mailed supporting evidence to Daniel and kept the complete photographic prints in his library. Edward learned of the plan. How? Kramer asked. Wolfe looked at Crane. Crane's shoulders sagged. I told him. You had administered the false records for 25 years, Wolfe said. Charles's confession would have exposed you to prosecution and disgrace. You informed Edward in exchange for his promise to protect you. Crane rubbed one wrist. He promised to destroy only the statement. Instead, he destroyed Charles. Margaret's face tightened. Wolfe turned to Edward. You telephoned Ashcroft House on the evening of the murder to confirm Charles was alone. You arrived shortly after 9. Mrs. Ward had already served his whiskey. While Charles opened the safe to show you the statement and photographs, you put cyanide into his glass. Edward met Wolfe's eyes. You cannot prove that. Dale Industrial Systems purchased the cyanide. Your automobile was seen near Ashcroft House. Your shoe left soil beside the side entrance. Mrs. Ward heard Charles accuse Edwin of cowardice during your telephone call. Robert Lane has testified that you ordered him to steal the blue envelope after Charles's death. Lane is a thief. Indeed, thieves may observe murderers accurately. Lane was not present, but his signed statement lay on Kramer's desk. Wolfe continued. You took the complete photograph and Charles's statement. You compelled Mr. Lane to telephone this house with a false account claiming Edwin had killed Edward at the quarry. You wished us to believe Edward had died 25 years ago. That story came from Charles. No, it came from you. It placed a dead Edward safely in the past, while Everett Dale remained a separate man. Saul laid out the records connecting Everett Dale to Edward Holloway, matching handwriting, school documents, company signatures, medical descriptions, and the photographs from Lydia's house formed a line no invented name could break. The most decisive evidence, Wolfe said, is the photograph itself. Edward looked toward the table despite himself. Mr. Kells demonstrated that Daniel's head had been inserted on your body. Your injured fingers, lowered shoulder, ring and coat remained visible. You later cut Daniel's face from Edwin's copy because you understood what an expert could discover. I never touched that picture. Your fingerprint was found on the inner surface of the mounting card. That was new to Edward. It was also new to me. His eyes shifted toward Kramer. Kramer smiled without warmth. The lab found it this afternoon. Wolfe had saved it for the right moment. Edward's control weakened, but only slightly. A fingerprint proves I handled a family photograph. It proves you handled it after the face had been removed, Wolfe said. The print lay across the freshly exposed inner edge and was preserved when Edwin placed the picture in its envelope. Edward said nothing. Wolfe leaned forward. You poisoned Charles because his confession would restore Daniel's identity and expose your fraud. You stole the true photograph because it connected Everett Dale to Edward Holloway. You seized Mr. Crane and attempted to reach Lydia because she possessed original invoices and letters, proving that you had impersonated Daniel. Lydia opened the leather folder on her lap. The papers inside were yellowed but intact. Edward searched my house, she said. He did not find these. Edward looked at her for the first time. You should have burned them. No, Lydia replied. That was your habit. His face changed. The calm disappeared. What remained had waited 25 years for a room in which no one feared it. You think Daniel was innocent, he demanded. He was going to take the company. He wanted to drag all of us through court and destroy everything Charles and Edwin had built. It was partly his, Margaret said. Edward turned on her. Your father knew what Daniel was. Weak, self-righteous, always willing to risk other people for his principles. Daniel rose slowly, leaning on his cane. You used my name to steal. I improved a company you would have divided. You threatened Lydia. You disappeared because you were paid. I disappeared because Charles told me you would kill her. Edward laughed. Charles told everyone whatever kept him comfortable. Wolfe's voice cut through the room. Did Charles refuse to remain comfortable on the night you poisoned him? Edward turned. For several seconds he stared at Wolfe. Then his shoulders lowered. He had the glass beside him, Edward said. He kept talking about confession and restitution, he said. Daniel would walk into the company office under his own name. Kramer moved closer. Edward continued, his voice flatter now. I told him the scandal would ruin Margaret and Clara. He said that was no longer his concern. So you put cyanide in whiskey, Kramer said. Edward looked at the floor. Yes. Clara closed her eyes. Margaret did not move, Kramer said. And the fraud? Edward's mouth twisted. I moved the money. Edwin knew some of it, Charles suspected. Walter prepared what I needed. Crane made a protesting sound. Edward glanced at him. You took your share. Kramer stepped behind Edward and placed a hand on his arm. You are under arrest for the murder of Charles Holloway. I was already under arrest. Now I have the confession. Pearlie opened the office door. The two officers took Edward into the hall. Before leaving, Edward looked at Daniel. For 25 years, one had lived under a stolen name and the other under an invented one. Neither spoke. Walter Crane was taken next. Kramer intended to charge him with conspiracy, fraud, obstruction, and whatever else the district attorney could attach, without breaking the paper. Samuel agreed to provide a full statement about the false settlement and buried evidence. Helen would testify about the family's knowledge of Edward's survival. Clara would surrender Edwin's remaining records. Lydia gave Kramer the original invoices and letters. Daniel remained after the others departed. Margaret stood before him uncertainly. You are my uncle, she said. Half uncle, Daniel replied. That seems sufficient. They left together with Lydia. At last the office was quiet. Fritz entered, collected the abandoned glasses, and informed Wolfe that cold roast beef, potato cakes, and a mustard sauce were available. Wolfe accepted the announcement with more warmth than he had shown Edward. I looked at the damaged photograph on the long table. A lot of trouble over one missing face. Wolfe closed his eyes. No, Archie. The trouble came from the fact that a missing face remained attached to a living man. I considered that. The photograph had outlived Edwin, exposed Edward, returned Daniel to his family, and restored Lydia to a history that had denied her. The empty oval no longer concealed anything. We knew whose face had occupied it, whose body had stood beneath it, who had altered the picture, and why Charles had died to preserve its truth. For once, no improvement was needed. The old genius had earned the last word.